Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing at the edge of an endless desert as the sun begins its slow descent toward the horizon. The air is warm against your skin, carrying with it the faint scent of sand and something ancient, something timeless. Before you stretches a ribbon of blue-green water, the great Nile River, flowing as it has for millions of years, carving life into the heart of an otherwise barren landscape. This is Egypt, a land where the impossible became reality, where human ambition reached toward the heavens and left monuments that would outlast empires. Tonight, we embark on a journey through 3,000 years of history, a civilization so enduring, so magnificent, that its legacy still captivates us millennia after its pharaohs turned to dust. This is not a story to be studied or memorized, but rather one to be experienced, to let wash over you like the gentle waters of the Nile itself. There is no need to remember every detail, every name, every date. Simply allow yourself to drift along this river of time and let the voices of ancient Egypt carry you into peaceful rest. Before we begin our journey together, if you find comfort in falling asleep to the whispers of history, a gentle subscribe helps us continue creating these nighttime voyages through time. And if you wish, feel free to leave a comment telling us where in the world you are listening from tonight. We love knowing that our community of history lovers spans continents and time zones, united by curiosity and the search for peaceful rest. Now, settle into comfort, let your breathing slow, and prepare to witness the birth of a civilization that would change the world forever. Chapter 1. Origins, the Nile, and the Beginning. In the beginning, there was only desert. Vast expanses of golden sand stretched in every direction, baked beneath an unforgiving sun, lifeless and silent, save for the whisper of wind across the dunes. But cutting through this sea of sand, like a miracle made manifest, flowed a river. The Nile, longest river in the world, wound its way from the heart of Africa northward to the Mediterranean Sea, bringing with it the promise of life in a land that should have known only death. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, often called the father of history, once wrote that Egypt is the gift of the Nile. No truer words were ever spoken. Without this great river, there would be no Egypt, no pharaohs, no pyramids, no civilization at all. The Nile was everything, the beginning and end of Egyptian existence, the source of all prosperity, the reason for all religion, the foundation upon which an empire would be built. Each year, like clockwork ordained by the gods themselves, the Nile would perform its miracle. As summer approached and the distant mountains of Ethiopia released their seasonal rains, the river would begin to swell. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, the waters would rise. The current would quicken. The color would change from clear blue-green to rich brown, heavy with sediment carried from 1,000 miles away. And then, sometime between June and September, the Nile would overflow its banks, spreading across the land in a gentle flood that brought not destruction, but life. This was the inundation, the annual flooding that made Egypt possible. As the waters receded in autumn, they left behind a gift more precious than gold, a thick layer of black, fertile silt, rich in nutrients, perfect for growing crops. The Egyptians called their land Kemet, which means the black land, referring to this dark, life-giving soil. Beyond the reach of the flood lay the Deshret, the Red Land, the desert where nothing grew and nothing lived. The contrast was stark, absolute. Where the Nile's waters reached, there was abundance. Beyond that narrow strip, there was only emptiness. Imagine standing on the bank of the Nile in those ancient times, in the cool hours before dawn. The air would be filled with sounds, the gentle lapping of water against papyrus reeds, the calls of ibis and heron stirring from their night's rest, the distant bellow of hippopotamus in the shallows. The sky would lighten slowly from black to deep purple to soft pink, and as the sun crested the eastern horizon, its light would turn the river into liquid gold. Fishermen would already be at work, casting their nets from small boats made of bundled papyrus reeds, their movements practiced and efficient. Along the banks, women would come down to fill clay jars with water, balancing them gracefully on their heads as they returned to their villages. The Nile flowed from south to north, which the Egyptians found deeply significant. The southern part of Egypt, where the river was narrower and more confined between desert cliffs, they called Upper Egypt, because it was upstream, higher in elevation. The northern part, where the river spread out into a vast delta before meeting the Mediterranean Sea, they called Lower Egypt, because it was downstream, lower in elevation. This division between Upper and Lower Egypt would shape the civilization's entire history, creating two distinct regions with different characters, different traditions, different identities, yet bound together by the river that flowed through both. The delta region of Lower Egypt was a world of water and green. Here the Nile branched into multiple channels, creating a landscape of marshlands, lagoons, and fertile islands. Papyrus grew thick and tall, forming dense thickets that sheltered countless birds and fish. It was lush, wet, and abundantly productive. Upper Egypt, by contrast, was a narrow ribbon of green pressed between walls of desert. The valley was rarely more than a dozen miles wide, sometimes narrowing to just a few hundred yards. Life here was more confined, more precarious, more dependent on the river's annual gift. But, in both regions, the rhythm of life followed the rhythm of the river. The Egyptian year was divided into 3 seasons, each defined by the Nile's behavior. First came Akhet, the inundation season, when the floods came and the land disappeared beneath the water. This was a time of rest, when farmers could not work their fields and instead were called upon to labor on the pharaoh's great building projects. Then came Pere, the growing season, when the waters receded and planting could begin. Seeds of wheat and barley would be scattered across the wet, fertile soil, and the crops would grow tall under the warm Egyptian sun. Finally came Shimu, the harvest season, when the grain was cut and gathered, when the Nile was at its lowest, when the land waited, parched and dry, for the cycle to begin again. This predictability, this reliable pattern repeated year after year, century after century, gave the Egyptians something precious: confidence in the future. Unlike other ancient peoples who lived in fear of floods, droughts, and famines that struck without warning, the Egyptians knew that the Nile would provide. They could plan. They could build. They could create a civilization that thought not just of survival, but of eternity. The river taught them that life was a cycle, that death led to rebirth, that what ended would begin again. These lessons would become fundamental to their religion, their art, their entire worldview. And so the Nile was more than just a river. It was a god, personified as Hapi, depicted as a man with a large belly and full breasts, symbolizing abundance and nourishment. It was a highway, the main artery of transportation and communication in a land where desert made overland travel difficult. It was a clock, marking the passage of seasons and years. It was a mother, feeding millions. It was the very essence of Egypt itself, the reason the civilization existed at all. Long before there were pharaohs or pyramids, before there was any Egypt as we know it, there were people, small bands of humans wandering the landscape, following game, gathering wild plants, living lives that left few traces behind. This was the Paleolithic era, the Old Stone Age, a time stretching back tens of thousands of years into the mists of prehistory. These early peoples were hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons, never staying long in any one place, their possessions limited to what they could carry. But gradually, slowly, over countless generations, something changed. The climate shifted. The land that is now the Sahara Desert was once much greener, wetter, capable of supporting life. As the region began to dry, becoming increasingly arid, the wild game moved away and the plants grew scarcer. The people were forced to adapt or perish, and so they began to gather along the banks of the only permanent water source remaining, the Nile River. Here, pressed together by necessity, they made a discovery that would change everything. They noticed that the wild grasses growing in the fertile silt left by the annual floods produced edible seeds, nutritious and plentiful. They learned that if they deliberately planted these seeds and protected the growing plants, they could produce more food than they could by simply foraging. They learned to cultivate wheat and barley, to domesticate animals like cattle, sheep, and goats. They learned, in short, to farm. And with farming came the possibility of staying in one place, of building permanent settlements, of creating a surplus that could support people who did not work in the fields. This was the Neolithic Revolution, the birth of agriculture, and it happened along the Nile Valley, around 8,000 years before the Common Era. Archaeological sites from this period reveal communities that had mastered not just farming, but a whole suite of technologies essential to settled life. They made pottery for storing grain and water, grinding stones for processing wheat into flour, baskets woven from reeds and grasses, simple jewelry from shells and stones. They buried their dead with care, placing grave goods beside the bodies, suggesting beliefs about an afterlife even in these earliest times. One of the most important of these early cultures was the Badarian, named after the site of El Badari in Middle Egypt, where their remains were first discovered. The Badarian people lived between approximately 4,400 and 4,000 years before the Common Era, and they represent our earliest clear picture of pre-dynastic Egyptian civilization. They were farmers primarily, but they also hunted and fished to supplement their diet. They lived in small villages of perhaps a few dozen families, their homes simple structures made of mud, brick, and reeds with thatched roofs. What makes the Badarian culture particularly fascinating is their pottery. Badarian potters created vessels of extraordinary beauty and technical sophistication, thin-walled and delicate, with polished red surfaces that sometimes featured black-topped rims created through controlled firing techniques. The clay was so thin in places that light could shine through it, almost translucent. This was not just functional pottery but art, evidence of an aesthetic sensibility, of people who valued beauty alongside utility. The Badarian people also showed great care in how they treated their dead. Bodies were placed in shallow oval pits, lying on their left sides in a contracted, fetal position, facing west toward the setting sun. This orientation would remain significant throughout all of Egyptian history, the west associated with death and the afterlife, the east with life and rebirth. Beside the body would be placed personal possessions, combs carved from ivory, cosmetic palettes made of stone for grinding minerals into makeup, tools of flint expertly knapped into shape, necklaces of shell and stone beads. These grave goods tell us that the Badarian people believed in some form of existence after death, that they thought the deceased would need or want these objects in whatever world came next. Trade networks were already extensive in this early period. Shells from the Red Sea, hundreds of miles away, have been found in Badarian graves. Certain types of stone used for pallets and beads came from quarries far up the Nile. This tells us that even these small, scattered communities were not isolated. They were connected, exchanging goods, and presumably ideas as well, across considerable distances. Following the Badarian came the Naqada cultures, named after the site of Naqada in Upper Egypt. These are divided into three phases: Naqada, the first, second, and third, spanning roughly the period from 4,400 to 3,100 years before the Common Era. Each phase showed increasing complexity, growing populations, more sophisticated technology, and clearer steps toward what would become dynastic Egyptian civilization. The Naqada first period, also called the Amratian culture, saw significant advances in pottery decoration. Instead of the polished red wares of the Badarian, Naqada first potters created vessels decorated with white painted designs on red clay surfaces. These decorations are invaluable to us because they show what mattered to these ancient people. We see geometric patterns, yes, but also animals, hippopotami, crocodiles, birds, ostriches, gazelles. We see boats with multiple oars and high curved prows, some carrying standards or emblems that might be early versions of the nome signs that would later identify Egypt's administrative districts. These boats appear again and again in Naqada first art, suggesting that river travel was already crucial for trade and communication. Some boats are shown carrying what appear to be shrines or religious symbols, hinting at the spiritual significance of the journey, perhaps already the beginning of the concept that would later become so central to Egyptian religion: the journey to the afterlife as a voyage by boat to another realm. The depictions of animals tell us about the environment these people inhabited. Many of the creatures shown, elephants, giraffes, various species of antelope, no longer live in Egypt today. The land was still green enough, wet enough, to support these populations, but the climate was continuing its slow shift toward greater aridity, pushing these animals farther south, concentrating human populations ever more tightly along the Nile's banks. Naqada, the second period, also called the Girzian culture, marked a crucial acceleration toward unification and statehood. This phase, lasting from approximately 3,500 to 3,200 years before the Common Era, saw dramatic changes in Egyptian society. Settlements grew larger, evolving from villages into towns. Social stratification became more pronounced, with clear evidence of an emerging elite class. Trade expanded significantly, with strong connections to Palestine and the Near East, bringing new goods and new ideas into Egypt. The pottery of Naqada II shows this foreign influence clearly. Decorated wares gave way to plain, highly polished vessels, and a new form appeared, wavy-handled jars that show clear influence from Palestinian ceramic traditions. These jars, along with other imported goods, demonstrate that Egypt was now part of a wider network of trade and cultural exchange spanning the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. But perhaps most significantly, Naqada II saw the emergence of large, complex settlements that can truly be called proto-cities. Hierakonpolis, located in Upper Egypt near modern Edfu, grew to cover more than 60 acres and contained specialized workshop areas for pottery production, brewing, and metallurgy. This was no longer a simple farming village, but a center of craft production and trade, a place where different specialists lived and worked together, dependent on each other and on the agricultural surplus that fed them all. The painted tomb at Hierakonpolis, dating to the late Naqada II period, gives us a rare glimpse into the life and beliefs of this time. Its walls feature paintings of boats, animals, and human figures engaged in what appears to be ceremonial or possibly military activities. We see rows of people, some holding standards aloft, others in what might be boats or shrines. The meaning is not entirely clear to us thousands of years later, but the care and skill with which these images were created speaks to their importance. Religious beliefs were clearly developing in sophistication during this period. Animal worship, which would become such a distinctive feature of Egyptian religion, seems to have its roots in these times. Cattle, essential for agricultural work and food, received particular veneration. We find elaborate cattle burials and artistic representations that emphasize the sacred nature of these animals. The relationship between humans and the animals that shared their environment was not merely practical, but deeply spiritual. Burial practices were becoming more elaborate, especially for the elite. Tombs grew larger and more complex. Grave goods increased in quantity and quality. Some burials contained hundreds of pottery vessels, many imported from far away, along with ivory objects, cosmetics, jewelry, and items that seemed to have been symbols of authority. Ceremonial mace heads, palettes with elaborate carved decorations, distinctive types of pottery vessels. And crucially, we begin to see the emergence of writing. The earliest examples of Egyptian hieroglyphs date to this period, found on pottery, clay, seal impressions, and bone and ivory labels. These early inscriptions are fragmentary, not complete sentences, but they represent the beginning of one of humanity's great intellectual achievements, the ability to preserve thoughts and information beyond the limits of human memory, to communicate across time and space through written symbols. The Naqada III period, from approximately 3,200 to 3,100 years before the Common Era, was the final phase before unification. Egypt was moving inexorably toward becoming a single state under a single ruler. Archaeological evidence suggests increasing warfare between regional powers, ambitious chieftains trying to expand their control. Weapons become more common in burials. Depictions of violence appear in art. The society was in transition, moving from a collection of independent communities to something larger, more organized, more powerful. Three main centers of power emerged in Upper Egypt during this period: Thinis, Naqada, and Nekhen, which the Greeks would later call Hierakonpolis. These were rival city-states, each controlling surrounding territory, each seeking to dominate the others. Meanwhile, in Lower Egypt, the Delta region had its own centers of power, its own cultural traditions, its own identity separate from the south. The stage was set for the event that would change everything, that would mark the beginning of dynastic Egypt and 3,000 years of pharaonic rule. Someone, somewhere, would find the vision and the strength to unite these disparate regions into a single kingdom. The age of the pharaohs was about to begin. Around 3,100 years before the Common Era, a king arose in Upper Egypt who would accomplish what no one had before: the unification of the entire Nile Valley under a single crown. Later Egyptian tradition called him Menes and credited him with founding the first dynasty and the capital city of Memphis. Modern scholars often identify him with King Narmer, whose name appears on artifacts from this crucial period. Whether Menes and Narmer were the same person, or whether the unification was accomplished over several generations by multiple rulers, remains debated. But what matters is that it happened, and that this moment marked the birth of Egypt as we know it. The famous Narmer palette, one of the most important artifacts from ancient Egypt, commemorates this unification. It is a ceremonial cosmetic palette, carved from a single piece of dark stone, about 2 feet tall, discovered at Hierakonpolis. Both sides are covered with carved relief images showing King Narmer. On one side, he wears the white crown of Upper Egypt and is shown smiting an enemy with a mace. On the other side, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt and walks in procession past rows of decapitated enemies. The message is clear. The two lands have been united through conquest, and a single king now rules over both. But unification was about more than military conquest. It represented the fusion of two distinct cultural regions into something new. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt each retained their own identity, their own traditions, their own patron deities. The pharaohs acknowledged this by adopting titles that emphasized their rule over both regions. They were king of Upper and Lower Egypt, lord of the two lands. They wore the double crown, the psent, which combined the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north into a single symbol of unified authority. Memphis, the new capital established by Menes, was strategically located at the junction between Upper and Lower Egypt, at the point where the Nile Valley opens up into the delta. Its Egyptian name was Ineb-Hej, meaning white walls, referring to the gleaming white limestone fortifications that protected it. Here, at the crossroads of the two lands, the pharaoh could govern his newly united kingdom, accessible to both north and south. The founding of Memphis marked more than just the establishment of a new city. It represented the creation of a new type of political organization, the centralized state. For the first time in Egypt, power was concentrated in the hands of a single ruler who claimed authority over the entire length of the Nile. This required the development of an administrative system to collect taxes, organize labor, maintain order, and carry out the pharaoh's will across hundreds of miles of territory. Scribes became essential, using their knowledge of writing to keep records, document transactions, and communicate royal commands. The early pharaohs established the fundamental patterns that would define Egyptian kingship for the next 3 millennia. The pharaoh was not merely a political leader, but a divine being, the living incarnation of the god Horus, the son of Ra, the sun god. This divine status placed the pharaoh above ordinary humans, making his word law and his person sacred. To approach the pharaoh was to approach a god. To serve the pharaoh was to serve the cosmic order itself. This concept of divine kingship had profound implications. It meant that the pharaoh's authority was not just political, but religious, not just temporal, but eternal. It meant that the pharaoh's tomb was not just a burial place, but a sacred space, a point of connection between the human world and the divine realm. It meant that the resources of the entire nation could be mobilized for royal projects, because to serve the king was to serve the gods, to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order of truth, justice, and harmony that kept chaos at bay. The first dynasty, beginning with Menes and lasting for approximately 200 years, laid the foundations for what would become one of history's greatest civilizations. Each pharaoh built upon the achievements of his predecessors, expanding the administration, developing the arts, establishing trade networks, and above all, constructing ever more elaborate tombs at Abydos and Saqqara, the great royal cemeteries of this early period. These tombs were not yet pyramids, but they were impressive nonetheless. They were underground chambers, sometimes quite extensive, roofed with wood and buried beneath rectangular superstructures of mud brick called mastabas. Around the royal tomb were smaller graves containing the servants and officials who had served the pharaoh in life and who were expected to continue serving him in death. This practice of retainer sacrifice would eventually be abandoned, replaced by symbolic representations, statues, paintings, and eventually the Shabti figures that would populate tombs of later periods. The second dynasty continued these trends, though our knowledge of this period is less complete than we might wish. We know the names of several kings, and we know that they faced challenges, including what appears to have been religious conflict between different factions supporting different gods. One king, Peribsen, broke with tradition by associating himself not with Horus but with Set, the god of chaos and the desert, suggesting theological or political disputes that have since been lost to history. His successor, Kasekemwi, seems to have resolved these conflicts, taking a name that meant the two powers appear, and associating himself with both Horus and Set, perhaps symbolizing the reconciliation of opposing factions. By the end of the Second Dynasty, around 2700 years before the Common Era, Egypt was stable, unified, and prosperous. The institution of pharaonic rule was firmly established. The administrative system functioned smoothly. Agricultural production supported a growing population. Trade brought wealth from abroad. The stage was set for the next great leap forward, the age of pyramid building, when Egyptian civilization would reach heights that still astonish us today. But before we journey to those soaring monuments of stone, take a moment to appreciate what had already been achieved. In just a few centuries, Egypt had transformed from a collection of farming villages into a unified kingdom with a sophisticated government, a complex religious system, developing arts and crafts, and an ambition that would not be satisfied with anything less than eternity. The character of Egyptian civilization was already formed, conservative, yet capable of great innovation, deeply religious, yet eminently practical, obsessed with death, yet in love with life, rooted in tradition, yet open to foreign influences, confident in the Nile's provision, yet always working to secure the future. And so, with the foundation laid, with the two lands united under the double crown, with the administrative machinery in place and the divine pharaoh at its head, Egypt stood ready to enter its first great age of achievement. The Old Kingdom was about to begin, and with it, one of the most remarkable building projects in human history. The pyramids that would stand as monuments to eternity, testaments to what humans could achieve when they believed that time itself could be defied. Chapter 2: Old Kingdom, the Pyramid Age. The Third Dynasty marked the beginning of what historians call the Old Kingdom, a period spanning approximately 5 centuries, from 2700 to 2200 years before the Common Era. This was the age when Egypt truly came into its own, when the United Kingdom found its voice and expressed it in stone. It was the age of the pyramids, those eternal monuments that still stand today as testimony to human ambition and ingenuity. But before the great pyramids of Giza rose from the desert sands, there was Djoser, and there was Imhotep. King Djoser, second ruler of the Third Dynasty, reigned around 2650 years before the Common Era. He would become famous not for military conquests or administrative reforms, but for his tomb, a structure so revolutionary, so unlike anything that had come before, that it changed the course of Egyptian architecture forever. And the man responsible for this innovation was Imhotep, Djoser's chancellor, high priest, and architect, a figure so remarkable that he would eventually be deified, worshipped as a god of wisdom and medicine for thousands of years after his death. Before Imhotep, royal tombs were mastabas, low rectangular structures of mud brick built over underground burial chambers. They were impressive in their way, but horizontal, earthbound, limited in their reach toward the sky. Imhotep envisioned something different. He would build Djoser's tomb not of mud brick but of stone, that eternal material. And he would build it not horizontally but vertically, rising toward the heavens where the gods dwelled. He would create, in effect, a stairway to the sky, a means for the pharaoh's spirit to ascend to the realm of Ra. The step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, as this structure came to be known, began as a traditional mastaba. But Imhotep expanded it, first in all directions to make it larger, then upward, adding layer upon layer, each slightly smaller than the one below, creating 6 distinct steps, rising to a height of over 200 feet. It was the tallest structure on Earth at the time of its completion, visible for miles across the desert, a mountain of stone built by human hands where no mountain had stood before. But the pyramid itself was only part of Imhotep's vision. He surrounded it with a vast complex of buildings and courtyards, all enclosed within a limestone wall over 30 feet high. There were temples, shrines, pavilions, corridors, and chambers, many decorated with carved reliefs and painted scenes. Some of these structures were purely symbolic, buildings that could not be entered, their doors carved but never opened, their rooms filled with rubble. They were architecture for the afterlife, meant not for the living but for the king's spirit, providing him with an eternal palace where he could continue his royal duties throughout eternity. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The limestone blocks were cut and fitted with precision. Columns were carved to resemble bundles of papyrus reeds or lotus plants, translating into stone the forms of earlier wooden and reed architecture. Walls were decorated with delicate reliefs showing the king performing rituals, running the Hatshepsut race to demonstrate his continued vitality, receiving tribute from his subjects. Every detail spoke of care, of reverence, of a determination to create something that would last forever. And it has lasted. 46 centuries later, the Step Pyramid still stands, weathered and worn but fundamentally intact, still dominating the Saqqara Plateau, still inspiring awe in all who see it. Imhotep's innovation, his leap from mud brick to stone, from horizontal to vertical, from temporary to eternal, set Egypt on a path that would culminate in the greatest architectural achievements of the ancient world. The pharaohs who followed Giza continued to experiment with pyramid design. There were attempts, some more successful than others, to move from the stepped profile to smooth sides. The pyramid at Midam appears to have been built as a step pyramid, but then filled in to create smooth faces, though the outer casing eventually collapsed, leaving a tower of stone rising from a mound of rubble. The bent pyramid at Dashur shows a curious change of angle partway up, perhaps because the original angle proved too steep and threatened structural collapse. The red pyramid, also at Dashur, successfully achieved smooth sides from base to summit, though at a relatively shallow angle. These pyramids, often called the transitional pyramids, show us the learning process, the trial and error, the gradual refinement of technique and understanding that prepared Egyptian architects and builders for their greatest achievement. By the beginning of the Fourth Dynasty, around 2600 years before the Common Era, everything was ready. The workforce was organized. The quarrying and transportation methods were perfected. The architectural knowledge was complete. And the ambition was unlimited. King Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, was the second pharaoh of the Fourth Dynasty. He reigned for approximately 23 years, and in that time he ordered the construction of a monument so massive, so precisely executed, so perfectly conceived, that it would be counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world and remain the tallest human-made structure on Earth for over 38 centuries. The Great Pyramid of Giza, Khufu's eternal resting place, is more than just a tomb. It is a mathematical marvel, an engineering triumph, a testament to what humans can achieve when vision, resources, and determination align. The statistics are staggering. The pyramid originally stood 481 feet tall, though the loss of its outer casing has reduced it to 455 feet today. Its base covers more than 13 acres. It contains an estimated 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing on average 2.5 tons, though some of the granite blocks in the internal chambers weigh as much as 80 tons. The precision of its construction is extraordinary. The base is level to within less than an inch across its entire 800-foot length. The sides are aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal directions, and the blocks are fitted together so tightly that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. How was it built? This question has fascinated people for millennia, spawning theories ranging from the plausible to the absurd, from ramps and levers to ancient technologies now lost, to intervention by beings from beyond the stars. The truth, while perhaps less dramatic than some theories suggest, is no less impressive. The Egyptians built the Great Pyramid with the tools and techniques available to them: copper chisels and saws for cutting limestone, wooden sledges for transporting blocks, ramps of mud, brick and rubble for raising stones to increasing heights, and above all, an enormous, well-organized workforce laboring for decades under the direction of skilled engineers and architects. Recent archaeological discoveries have shed light on how this workforce was organized and maintained. The workers were not slaves, as popular imagination often suggests, but paid laborers, many of them farmers fulfilling their labor obligation to the state during the inundation season when their fields were underwater and they could not farm. They lived in purpose-built workers' villages near the pyramid site, housed in dormitories, fed from state granaries, and cared for when they were injured or ill. We have found their cemeteries, their bakeries, their breweries, the infrastructure that supported the greatest construction project the world had yet seen. The interior of the Great Pyramid is as impressive as its exterior. A system of passages and chambers penetrates deep into the structure and rises high within it. The Grand Gallery, a corbelled passage nearly 90 feet long and 28 feet high, ascends at a steep angle toward the king's chamber, the granite-lined room at the pyramid's heart, where Khufu's sarcophagus still rests, empty now for millennia. The precision with which these internal spaces were constructed, the way the massive granite beams were positioned above the king's chamber to distribute the weight of millions of tons of stone, demonstrates an understanding of engineering principles that would not be fully appreciated for thousands of years. The Great Pyramid did not stand alone. It was the centerpiece of a vast mortuary complex that included temples, causeways, and subsidiary pyramids. At the pyramid's base stood a mortuary temple where priests would perform daily rituals to sustain the pharaoh's spirit. A long causeway, originally enclosed and decorated with reliefs, led down to a valley temple near the Nile, where the king's body would have been received and prepared for burial. 3 smaller pyramids, usually attributed to Khufu's queens, stood beside the great structure, and 100 or more mastaba tombs housed the officials and nobles who wished to spend eternity near their king. Khufu's son, Djedefre, chose to build his pyramid at Abu Rawash, north of Giza, perhaps seeking to establish his own necropolis rather than build in his father's shadow. But Djedefre's pyramid was never completed, and his reign was short. It was Khufu's other son, Khafre, who would return to Giza and create the second great pyramid of that legendary site. Khafre's pyramid appears nearly as large as his father's, though it is actually slightly smaller, an optical illusion created by its position on higher ground and its steeper angle. But Khafre's monument includes something his father's lacked: the Great Sphinx, that enigmatic guardian with the body of a lion and the face of a king, carved from a massive outcrop of limestone left behind by the quarrying operations that provided stone for the pyramids. The Sphinx gazes eastward, toward the rising sun, and has done so for more than 4,500 years. Weathered by wind and sand, eroded by time, yet still powerful, still mysterious, still magnificent. The face of the Sphinx is generally believed to represent Khafre himself, though some scholars have argued for other identifications. Whoever it depicts, the Sphinx embodied the pharaoh's role as the guardian of Egypt, combining human intelligence with the strength and ferocity of the lion, king of beasts. Between its paws once stood a chapel, and in front of it stood stelae recording royal restorations and prayers. The Sphinx was not merely decorative but deeply symbolic, a representation of royal power watching over the necropolis and, by extension, the entire land of Egypt. The third and final Great Pyramid of Giza was built by Menkaure, Khafre's successor. It is considerably smaller than the other two, rising to less than half the height of Khufu's monument, but what it lacks in size, it makes up for in the quality of its materials. The lower courses of Menkaure's pyramid were cased not in limestone, but in red granite brought from Aswan, hundreds of miles to the south, a massively expensive undertaking that demonstrates the wealth and ambition still available to 4th dynasty pharaohs. Menkaure's pyramid complex also included 3 small subsidiary pyramids and a beautiful mortuary temple where some of the finest sculpture of the Old Kingdom was discovered, including the famous triads showing Menkaure flanked by the goddess Hathor and the personification of a gnome, the districts into which Egypt was divided. These statues, carved from dark schist and highly polished, demonstrate the artistic sophistication that accompanied architectural achievement during this remarkable period. Together, the 3 pyramids of Giza, along with the Sphinx and the surrounding tombs and temples, create what is perhaps the most recognizable archaeological landscape on Earth. They have inspired countless travelers, scholars, artists, and dreamers. Napoleon's soldiers saw them and were told that 40 centuries looked down upon them. Arab historians of the Middle Ages speculated about their purpose and contents. Renaissance scholars measured and studied them. Modern archaeologists have excavated around them, revealing ever more about the civilization that created them. And yet mysteries remain. We still debate exactly how they were built, exactly what symbolic meanings they held, exactly what rituals were performed within their temples. But stand before them, these mountains of stone, raised by human hands, and the details fade into insignificance beside the overwhelming reality of their presence. They speak of a civilization at the height of its powers, confident in its understanding of the world, secure in its resources, certain of its ability to defeat death itself through the permanence of stone. They speak of thousands upon thousands of people working together toward a common goal, organized and directed by a government of remarkable capability. They speak of faith, of belief so strong that decades of labor seemed not too much to ask if it meant securing eternal life for the god-king who ruled them. The fourth dynasty represents the zenith of pyramid building, but it was not the end. Subsequent dynasties continued to build pyramids, though none would match the scale of Khufu's achievement. The fifth and sixth dynasties built smaller pyramids, but they included something the earlier structures lacked: texts. The walls of the burial chambers in these later pyramids were inscribed with spells, prayers, and rituals designed to assist the deceased pharaoh in his journey through the afterlife. These pyramid texts, as they are known, are the oldest religious writings in the world, and they provide invaluable insights into Egyptian beliefs about death, the afterlife, and the gods. The pyramids were not built in isolation. They were the most visible element of a complex society that had developed sophisticated systems in every area of human endeavor. The Old Kingdom saw the full flowering of Egyptian art, with sculptors creating masterpieces that still move us with their grace and power. The seated scribe, cross-legged and alert, his eyes inlaid with crystal that seems to look into your soul. The statues of nobles and their families, formal and dignified, meant to serve as eternal homes for their ka, their spiritual double. The reliefs in mastaba tombs, showing daily life in extraordinary detail, workers in the fields, cattle being herded, bread being baked, beer being brewed, fish being caught, birds being trapped, all the activities that sustained life along the Nile. The society that created these wonders was hierarchical and carefully organized. At the top stood the pharaoh, divine and absolute, the living god through whom all authority flowed. Below him were the viziers, the highest officials who managed the government on the king's behalf. Then came the nomarchs, the governors of Egypt's administrative districts, each responsible for tax collection, labor organization, and maintaining order in their territory. Below them were scribes, priests, craftsmen, soldiers, and at the base of the pyramid, the farmers who worked the land and produced the surplus that supported everyone else. This was not a money economy. There were no coins, no paper currency. Instead, the system operated on what we might call redistribution. The state collected taxes in the form of grain, livestock, and labor. These resources were stored in royal granaries and workshops, then distributed as wages and rations to those who served the state. A scribe might receive a certain amount of grain per month, along with beer, oil, and linen. A craftsman working on a royal tomb would be housed and fed by the state. The system worked because the Nile was so productive, because the annual flood was so reliable, because there was always enough, and usually more than enough. Religion permeated every aspect of Egyptian life during the Old Kingdom. The gods were everywhere, in the river and the sun, in the falcon that soared overhead and the cobra that basked on warm stones. Ra, the sun god, sailed across the sky each day in his solar barque, bringing light and life to the world. At night he journeyed through the underworld, battling the forces of chaos, emerging victorious each dawn to repeat the cycle. Osiris ruled the underworld, the realm of the dead, having himself died and been resurrected through the love and magic of his sister wife Isis. Horus, their son, was the divine prototype of every pharaoh, the rightful king who defeated his uncle Set and claimed the throne of Egypt. The Egyptians did not fear death, not in the way we often do. They saw it as a transition, a doorway to another form of existence that could, if proper preparations were made, be even more pleasant than earthly life. But this required preservation of the body, for the ka, the spiritual essence of a person, needed a physical home to which it could return. And so they developed the art of mummification, removing the internal organs, treating the body with natron to dry it out, wrapping it in linen, reciting spells, performing rituals, all to ensure that the deceased would live forever in the field of reeds, that paradise where the harvests were always abundant and life was eternally good. The Old Kingdom lasted for approximately 5 centuries, a remarkably long period of stability and achievement. But nothing lasts forever, not even the most powerful civilizations. As the Sixth Dynasty progressed, cracks began to appear in the edifice of pharaonic power. The nomarchs, the regional governors, grew stronger and more independent. They built their own tombs in their own provinces, rather than seeking burial near the king at Memphis or Saqqara. They began to think of their positions not as appointments from the crown, but as hereditary possessions to be passed to their sons. The pharaohs tried to maintain control, but their resources were stretched thin. The building of pyramids, those massive drains on manpower and materials, had continued for generations. The exemptions from taxation granted to temples and royal estates had reduced the crown's income. Climate change may have played a role as well, with the Nile's floods becoming less reliable, agricultural production declining, famine threatening. Around 2200 years before the Common Era, the Old Kingdom collapsed. The central government lost control. The country fragmented into competing regions ruled by powerful nomarchs. The age of the Great Pyramids was over. Egypt entered what historians call the First Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation and, some texts suggest, considerable hardship. But even as the Old Kingdom fell, even as royal power dissolved and the unity of the two lands broke apart, the achievements of that remarkable age endured. The pyramids stood and stand still. The artistic conventions established then would guide Egyptian art for thousands of years. The religious beliefs crystallized during the Old Kingdom would form the foundation of Egyptian theology throughout the pharaonic period. The memory of the Old Kingdom, of its power and prosperity and its monumental achievements, would inspire later generations to restore what had been lost, to reunite the two lands, to make Egypt great again. And so we leave the age of pyramids as night deepens and the stars wheel overhead, the same stars the ancient Egyptians saw, the same constellations they identified with their gods. The pyramids rise dark against the sky, their smooth sides stripped away long ago, their treasures looted, their burial chambers empty. Yet they remain, testimony to human ambition, human skill, human determination to leave something behind that will outlast our brief time on earth. They remain as monuments not just to the pharaohs who built them, but to all the unnamed thousands who quarried the stone, transported the blocks, fitted them into place, who labored under the Egyptian sun to create something eternal. Their names are forgotten, but their work endures, and perhaps that is immortality enough. Chapter 3. The Intermediate Periods and the Middle Kingdom. When the Old Kingdom fell, Egypt did not simply cease to exist. The river still flowed, the sun still rose, the farmers still planted their fields when the floods receded. But the unity that had defined Egypt for half a millennium was broken. The pharaoh no longer commanded the resources of the entire nation. The great building projects ceased. The machinery of centralized government ground to a halt. Egypt fragmented into competing regions, each controlled by a nomarch who now ruled as an independent king in all but name. This is the First Intermediate Period, spanning roughly from 2200 to 2050 years before the Common Era. The name itself suggests chaos and decline, and certainly there were difficulties. Ancient texts speak of famine, of social upheaval, of the breakdown of traditional order. The Admonitions of Ipuwer, a literary text from this period, paints a picture of a world turned upside down, where the poor have become rich and the rich impoverished, where tombs are plundered and sacred places violated, where the Nile fails to flood and hunger stalks the land. Yet we must be careful not to accept such texts at face value. They were written with particular purposes, often political or religious, and they may exaggerate conditions for dramatic or persuasive effect. The archaeological evidence suggests that life continued, that communities survived, that Egyptian culture remained fundamentally intact, even as political unity dissolved. This was not the end of civilization, but rather a transformation, a redistribution of power from the center to the regions. In fact, some areas flourished during the First Intermediate Period. The nomarchs who now ruled independently could invest resources in their own provinces, rather than sending everything to the distant capital. They built tombs for themselves, decorated with lively scenes of daily life. They patronized local artists and craftsmen. Literature flourished, with new genres emerging that questioned old certainties and explored themes of wisdom, proper governance, and the nature of a good life. The Instructions for Merikare, a text supposedly written by a king to his son, discusses the responsibilities of rulers and the importance of justice and mercy. But the desire for reunification was always present, the memory of the old kingdom's glory never forgotten. Two main centers of power emerged as the first intermediate period progressed. In the north, based at Heracleopolis in Middle Egypt, one line of kings claimed to rule as pharaohs. In the south, based at Thebes in Upper Egypt, another line made the same claim. For a time, these two dynasties coexisted, perhaps even cooperated, but eventually conflict became inevitable. Each side claimed to be the legitimate rulers of all Egypt. Each side sought to restore the unity of the two lands under their own crown. The struggle was long, and its details are imperfectly known to us. But gradually, over several generations, the Theban kings gained the upper hand. They pushed northward, bringing first Upper Egypt fully under their control, then extending their power into Middle Egypt, finally confronting the Heracleopolitan kings directly. Around 2050 years before the Common Era, a Theban king named Mentuhotep II succeeded in conquering the north and reuniting Egypt under a single crown. The relief in Mentuhotep's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, built into the cliffs on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, shows him wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. He had accomplished what no one had done for a century and a half. He had made Egypt whole again. This achievement marks the beginning of what historians call the Middle Kingdom, a second great age of Egyptian civilization that would last for approximately 3 centuries. Mentuhotep II did not merely conquer. He worked to heal the divisions that had torn Egypt apart. He honored the gods in both north and south. He appointed officials who could administrate efficiently and fairly. He undertook building projects that employed thousands and demonstrated the renewed strength of the central government. His mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahari, with its distinctive colonnaded terraces built against the cliff face, was innovative in design and ambitious in scale, a statement in stone that Egypt had returned to greatness. The reunification brought stability, and stability brought prosperity. The 12th dynasty, founded by Amenemhat I, around 1991 years before the Common Era, presided over what many scholars consider the high point of Middle Kingdom Egypt. These kings were not gods remote and unapproachable like the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom. Their portraits show them as mature men, sometimes even aging men, their faces marked with lines of care and responsibility. They were rulers, yes, but rulers who bore the weight of their office, who understood that kingship meant duty and service as much as power and privilege. Amenemhat I was a usurper, not of royal blood, who seized power in circumstances that remain unclear. Perhaps because his claim to the throne was questionable, he worked hard to legitimize his rule and establish a dynasty that would endure. He moved the capital from Thebes to a new city called Ich-Tawi, whose name means Amenemhat takes possession of the two lands, located near the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt, just as Memphis had been in the Old Kingdom. From this central position, he and his successors could govern the entire country effectively. One of Amenemhat's most important innovations was establishing a system of co-regency, where the reigning pharaoh would elevate his chosen heir to rule alongside him for several years before his own death. This ensured smooth transitions of power, prevented succession crises, and allowed the younger king to learn the business of ruling while his father was still alive to guide him. The practice would continue throughout the Middle Kingdom and helped maintain the stability that characterized the period. Amenemhat's son, Senusret I, continued his father's policies and expanded Egypt's influence abroad. He led military campaigns into Nubia to the south, securing access to the gold mines that provided Egypt with its most precious metal. He fortified the border, building a chain of massive mud brick fortresses along the Nile that served both as military bases and as customs posts to control and tax trade. These fortresses were engineering marvels in their own right, with walls 40 feet high and 20 feet thick, with complex designs featuring multiple gates, killing grounds, and defensive towers. But Senusret was more than a warrior king. He was a great patron of architecture and the arts. He added to temple complexes throughout Egypt, building in both traditional and innovative styles. The White Chapel he constructed at Karnak, reconstructed by modern archaeologists from blocks reused in later buildings, is considered one of the most beautiful structures to survive from ancient Egypt, its pillars carved with exquisite reliefs and hieroglyphic inscriptions listing all the nomes of Egypt. His successor, Amenemhat II, continued the dynasty's work of building and consolidating. Then came Senusret II, who turned his attention to an ambitious irrigation project in the Fayum, a large oasis depression west of the Nile, connected to the river by a channel. By controlling the flow of water into the Fayum, regulating it through dams and canals, Senusret was able to reclaim thousands of acres of previously marshy land for agriculture, significantly increasing Egypt's productive capacity. The Fayum would remain an important agricultural region for the rest of Egyptian history, a testament to the engineering vision of the Middle Kingdom. But the greatest of the 12th dynasty pharaohs, the one whose name became legendary, was Senusret III, who reigned from approximately 1878 to 1839 years before the Common Era. He was remembered by later generations as Egypt's greatest conqueror, a warrior king who expanded the borders and crushed all opposition. His military campaigns pushed deep into Nubia, extending Egyptian control farther south than ever before. He dug a canal at the First Cataract to facilitate the movement of ships and troops. He built new fortresses and strengthened existing ones. But Senusret III's most important achievements were administrative rather than military. He recognized that the power of the nomarchs, those regional governors whose independence had grown during the First Intermediate Period and had never been fully curtailed even after reunification, posed a threat to central authority. And so he systematically reduced their power, reorganizing the kingdom's administration to eliminate their autonomy. He divided Egypt into new administrative districts that did not correspond to the old nomes, and he appointed officials who served at his pleasure and could be dismissed at his will. The office of nomarch effectively ceased to exist. This was a revolutionary change, one that required considerable skill to accomplish without provoking revolt. Senusret achieved it through a combination of strength and diplomacy, making it clear that resistance would be crushed while offering opportunities for the old nomarch families to serve the crown in other capacities. The result was a more centralized, more efficiently governed state that could mobilize resources and direct them toward royal projects with a unity of purpose not seen since the Old Kingdom. The portraits of Senusret III that survive are among the most striking royal images from ancient Egypt. Unlike the serene, idealized faces of earlier pharaohs, Senusret's statues show a mature man with a serious, almost brooding expression, his face lined, his eyes deep set, his mouth set in what might be read as determination or perhaps weariness. These are the features of a man who has known responsibility and hardship, who has made difficult decisions and borne their consequences. They are remarkably human portraits, suggesting a ruler who did not claim divine perfection but rather earned respect through accomplishment and character. Senusret's son, Amenemhat III, inherited a strong, prosperous, well-governed kingdom and presided over its golden age. His reign of approximately 45 years was largely peaceful, allowing him to focus on building projects and economic development. He completed his father's work in the Fayum, building a major temple to the crocodile god Sobek at a site the Greeks would later call Crocodilopolis. He quarried extensively in the Sinai for turquoise and copper. He maintained active trade relations with the Near East, importing cedar from Lebanon, olive oil, and wine from Syria and Palestine, luxury goods from as far away as Mesopotamia and Anatolia. The Middle Kingdom was not just a time of political and economic achievement, but also of remarkable cultural flourishing. Literature reached new heights of sophistication and emotional depth. The tale of Sinuhe, one of the masterpieces of ancient Egyptian literature, tells the story of an official who flees Egypt after the death of Amenemhat I, fearing he will be implicated in a conspiracy. He lives for years in Syria, marries, prospers, but always longs for home. In his old age, the new pharaoh pardons him and invites him to return, and Sinuhe comes back to Egypt, where he is honored and eventually buried in a tomb near the king. The story is beautifully told, psychologically complex, exploring themes of loyalty, homesickness, identity, and the meaning of home. The story of the eloquent peasant is another literary gem from this period. It recounts how a peasant who has been robbed appeals to officials for justice. His initial complaint is so eloquently stated that the officials, amused and impressed, keep him talking, repeatedly delaying their judgment just to hear more of his speeches. Eventually, of course, justice is done, and the peasant receives not only compensation but also reward for his eloquence. The story is both entertaining and serious, exploring questions of justice, rhetoric, and the responsibilities of those in power. Wisdom literature also flourished during the Middle Kingdom. Texts like the Instructions of Amenemhat and the Loyalist Instruction offered advice on how to live a good life, how to serve one's superiors faithfully, how to speak wisely and act prudently. These texts reveal the values that Egyptians of this period held dear: discretion, loyalty, competence, self-control, respect for authority, balanced with a sense of justice. Religious developments during the Middle Kingdom would have lasting importance. The god Amun, originally a local deity of Thebes, rose to prominence as the Theban kings who reunified Egypt naturally promoted their city's patron god. Amun would eventually be combined with Ra to become Amun-Ra, king of the gods, principal deity of the Egyptian pantheon for much of the rest of pharaonic history. The great temple complex at Karnak, which would grow over centuries to become the largest religious structure ever built, began in the Middle Kingdom as successive pharaohs added halls, courts, and sanctuaries to honor Amun. But perhaps the most significant religious development of the Middle Kingdom was the democratization of the afterlife. In the Old Kingdom, the elaborate rituals and spells that ensured eternal life had been the exclusive preserve of the pharaoh and, to a lesser extent, the highest nobility. The pyramid texts carved in royal burial chambers were meant for royal use alone. But during the First Intermediate Period and the Middle Kingdom, these texts spread downward through society. They were adapted and expanded, painted on the inside of wooden coffins belonging to officials and even relatively ordinary people, and thus came to be known as the coffin texts. This meant that eternal life in the field of reeds was now available not just to kings, but to anyone who could afford the proper burial equipment and knew the proper spells. Osiris, god of the underworld, became increasingly important as the judge who would weigh each person's heart against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was light, unburdened by sin, the deceased would be admitted to paradise. If heavy with wrongdoing, the heart would be devoured by Ammit, a composite monster, and the person would cease to exist. This was democracy of a sort, a belief that virtue rather than birth determined one's fate in the afterlife. The Middle Kingdom lasted for approximately 3 centuries, a long period by any measure, though shorter than the Old Kingdom had been. The later kings of the 12th dynasty were less distinguished than their predecessors, and the 13th dynasty that followed saw rapid turnover of rulers and gradual weakening of central authority. Egypt did not collapse as dramatically as it had at the end of the Old Kingdom, but power slowly slipped away from the crown, and unity once again began to fray. And then came something new, something Egypt had never experienced in all its long history: foreign invasion. People from the east, from the lands of Syria and Palestine, began migrating into the delta in increasing numbers. They were called the Hyksos, which probably means rulers of foreign lands, and they brought with them new technologies, new weapons, new ways of war that the Egyptians had never encountered. They had horse-drawn chariots, compound bows, bronze weapons superior to Egypt's copper ones, and gradually they took control of Lower Egypt, establishing their own dynasty ruling from the city of Avaris in the delta. Egypt was divided once more, this time not between competing Egyptian dynasties, but between Egyptian rulers in the south and foreign rulers in the north. The Theban kings, who controlled Upper Egypt, paid tribute to the Hyksos and nominally acknowledged their overlordship, but they chafed under foreign domination. In Thebes, away in the south, memories were preserved of the days when Egypt had been united and free, when Egyptian pharaohs had commanded the two lands without bowing to any foreign power. This is how the Middle Kingdom ended, not with dramatic collapse, but with slow dissolution and foreign encroachment. Yet the achievements of the period endured. The literature continued to be copied and read for centuries. The administrative reforms persisted. The religious developments shaped Egyptian theology for the rest of the pharaonic period. The fortresses in Nubia still stood. The temples still received offerings. And in Thebes, in Upper Egypt, far from the Hyksos rulers in the north, the spark of resistance was kindled. the determination to drive out the foreigners and reunite Egypt under native rule. The Second Intermediate Period had begun, a time of division and foreign rule that would last for more than a century. But it would not last forever. In Thebes, the princes of that ancient city were gathering their strength, training their soldiers, perfecting new weapons and tactics learned from their enemies. They remembered the glory of the Middle Kingdom. They remembered Senusret III and Amenemhat III. They remembered when Egypt had been great. And they were determined that Egypt would be great again, that the foreigners would be expelled, that the two lands would be reunited under the double crown. The stage was being set for the new kingdom, for Egypt's imperial age, for the period when the civilization of the Nile would reach heights undreamed of, even by the builders of the Great Pyramids. But that is a story for another time, for another chapter in this long journey through the ages. For now, as the Middle Kingdom fades into history and Egypt enters its time of trial and division, let us pause and appreciate what had been achieved. A reunified kingdom after generations of fragmentation, 3 centuries of stability and prosperity, remarkable advances in art and literature, religious developments that would shape Egyptian spirituality for millennia. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs had proven that Egypt could recover from disaster, that the unity of the two lands could be restored, that the dream of the Old Kingdom could be revived and renewed. They had shown that civilizations need not die when they fall, that with courage and wisdom and determination, what has been lost can be found again, what has been broken can be made whole. It was a lesson that would serve Egypt well in the difficult times ahead. Chapter 4. New Kingdom, the Golden Age. The darkness before dawn is often the deepest, and so it was for Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. The Hyksos controlled the delta and much of Middle Egypt, ruling from their capital at Avaris with their foreign ways and their superior military technology. The Theban kings in the south paid them tribute and tried to maintain what independence they could. Between these two powers, caught in the middle, were various petty kingdoms and local rulers trying to survive in a fragmented land. Egypt, which had once commanded respect throughout the known world, was divided, diminished, subject to foreign overlords. It must have seemed to many Egyptians that the great days were gone forever, that the glory of the Old and Middle Kingdoms would never return. But in Thebes, in that ancient city far up the Nile, where the cliffs press close to the river and the desert is never far away, the flame of resistance still burned. The Theban princes had not forgotten what Egypt had been. They trained their soldiers. They studied the new weapons and tactics the Hyksos had brought. They waited for their moment. And finally, in the mid-16th century before the Common Era, they struck. Seqenenretau, a Theban king, began the War of Liberation. We know little of the details, but we know how it ended for him. His mummy shows terrible head wounds, the marks of battle axes and daggers, suggesting he died fighting the Hyksos in combat. His son, Kamosi, continued the struggle, pushing northward, attacking Hyksos positions, winning victories but unable to deliver the final blow. It would fall to Kamosi's brother, or perhaps cousin, a young man named Ahmose, to complete what his predecessors had begun. Ahmosi I, founder of the 18th dynasty, began his reign as a boy, but he would become a warrior king of legendary skill. He trained his forces, built ships to control the Nile, mastered the use of chariots and compound bows that had given the Hyksos their advantage. And then he struck northward in a series of campaigns that gradually pushed the foreign rulers back. He besieged Avaris, the Hyksos capital, and after a long struggle, he took it. The Hyksos fled eastward into Palestine, and Ahmose pursued them, ensuring they could never threaten Egypt again. But Ahmose did more than expel the Hyksos. He reunited Egypt, bringing both north and south under his crown. He re-established the borders, campaigning in Nubia to secure the gold-producing regions and restore Egyptian control in the south. He began the process of rebuilding temples that had fallen into disrepair during the long years of division. And perhaps most importantly, he reformed the military, creating a professional standing army rather than relying on temporary levies of farmers. This army, equipped with the latest weapons and trained in the newest tactics, would be the instrument through which Egypt would not merely restore its independence but build an empire. With Ahmose, the new kingdom began, and it would prove to be Egypt's longest and most glorious age, lasting approximately 500 years, from around 1550 to 1070 years before the Common Era. This would be Imperial Egypt, a great power on the world stage, respected and feared by kingdoms from Mesopotamia to the Aegean. Egyptian pharaohs would campaign in Syria and Palestine, pushing their borders farther than ever before. Egyptian gold would flow to foreign courts. Foreign princesses would come to marry Egyptian kings. The names of Egypt's rulers would be known throughout the civilized world. Ahmose's successors consolidated his achievements. Amenhotep I, his son, continued military campaigns in Nubia and began the custom of building royal tombs in a hidden valley on the west bank at Thebes, separate from the mortuary temples where offerings would be made. This valley, which we know as the Valley of the Kings, would become the royal necropolis for most of the New Kingdom, a place where pharaohs hoped their mummies could rest undisturbed for eternity, protected by the mountain peak that rises above it like a natural pyramid. Then came Thutmose I, who may not have been of pure royal blood, but who proved himself through military prowess. He led campaigns deep into Nubia, pushing the border farther south than any pharaoh before him. He campaigned in Syria, reaching the Euphrates River, setting up a victory stela on its banks to mark the farthest extent of Egyptian power. Egypt was no longer merely defending its borders but projecting power abroad, demanding tribute from foreign lands, establishing itself as the dominant force in the Near East. But the most remarkable ruler of the early 18th dynasty was neither a warrior king nor a conqueror, but a woman. Hatshepsut, daughter of Thutmose I, was married to her half-brother Thutmose II, as was common in the royal family. When he died after a short reign, his son by a minor wife, the future Thutmose III, was still a child. Hatshepsut became regent, ruling in the boy's name until he came of age. But as the years passed, Hatshepsut did something unprecedented. She declared herself pharaoh, taking all the titles and regalia of kingship, even wearing the false beard that was part of royal ceremonial dress. For approximately 22 years, Hatshepsut ruled Egypt as pharaoh, and her reign was marked not by military conquest, but by prosperity, building projects, and trade. She was particularly proud of her trading expedition to Punt, a land somewhere on the African coast, perhaps modern Somalia or Eritrea, from which Egyptian ships returned laden with myrrh trees, incense, ebony, ivory, and exotic animals. The walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, built against the cliffs in a stunning architectural achievement featuring terraced colonnades, show this expedition in detailed reliefs. The ships sailing south, the Queen of Punt coming to meet the Egyptians, the goods being loaded for the return journey, the myrrh trees being planted in Egypt. Hatshepsut's temple is one of the most beautiful structures to survive from ancient Egypt, its clean lines and elegant proportions harmonizing perfectly with the natural cliff face behind it. It was designed by Senenmut, her chief steward, and perhaps her lover, though the nature of their relationship remains debated. What is clear is that Hatshepsut presided over a peaceful and prosperous period, that she was accepted as legitimate ruler by most of the elite, and that she left behind monuments of lasting beauty. After Hatshepsut's death, or possibly earlier, her stepson Thutmose III finally took full power. Later in his reign, perhaps after potential rivals were safely dead, he ordered Hatshepsut's images defaced and her name removed from monuments, attempting to erase her from history. Whether this was personal vindictiveness, political necessity, or ideological objection to female rule, we cannot know. But he could not erase her temple or her achievements, and modern scholars have restored her to her rightful place in history as one of Egypt's most successful rulers. Thutmose III himself would become known as Egypt's greatest warrior king, the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. Once free from Hatshepsut's oversight, he launched a series of military campaigns into Syria and Palestine that would continue for decades. In his first campaign, he confronted a coalition of Syrian princes at Megiddo, a strategic fortress city. The battle was hard fought, but Thutmose's tactical skill and personal courage won the day. He besieged Megiddo for 7 months until it surrendered, and the victory established Egyptian dominance in the region. Over the next 20 years, Thutmose campaigned in Syria nearly every year, crushing revolts, collecting tribute, expanding Egyptian control. He crossed the Euphrates and defeated the kingdom of Mitanni, Egypt's main rival for control of Syria. He built an empire that stretched from the fourth cataract of the Nile in the south to the Euphrates in the north, the largest territory Egypt would ever control. Foreign kings sent tribute, silver and gold, horses and chariots, slaves and exotic goods. Egypt was the superpower of its age, and Thutmose was its architect. But Thutmose was more than a warrior. He was a builder who added to the temple of Amun at Karnak, creating the festival hall with its unique tent-pole columns. He was a scholar who collected foreign plants and animals, having them depicted on the walls of the botanical garden room in his temple. He was a statesman who established an efficient system of administration for the empire, appointing governors in conquered territories, ensuring the steady flow of tribute back to Egypt. His reign of 54 years, including the years when Hatshepsut ruled, was one of the most successful in all of Egyptian history. The kings who followed maintained the empire Thutmose had built. Amenhotep II, his son, was known for his physical prowess, his skill with the bow, his strength in combat. Thutmose IV is remembered for restoring the Great Sphinx at Giza, which by his time was already over 1,000 years old and buried in sand up to its neck. According to the story he recorded on a stela between the Sphinx's paws, the god appeared to him in a dream while he slept in the monument's shadow, promising him the throne if he would clear away the sand. Thutmose did so, and he did indeed become pharaoh. Then came Amenhotep III, who inherited an empire at peace and a treasury full of foreign gold. His reign of approximately 38 years was the high point of New Kingdom prosperity. He built on a scale not seen since the Pyramid Age, a mortuary temple so large that only ruins remain today, including the two massive seated statues known as the Colossi of Memnon that still dominate the West Bank at Luxor. He added to Karnak and to Luxor Temple. He built a pleasure palace at Malkata, complete with an artificial lake where the royal family could sail for recreation. Amenhotep III presided over a cosmopolitan court where foreign influence was welcomed. His chief wife, Tie, was not of royal blood, but the daughter of provincial officials, yet she wielded considerable influence. Foreign princesses came to join his harem, bringing diplomatic alliances. Artists working in the Amarna style, which would reach its full flowering under his son, began to develop more naturalistic forms, moving away from the rigid conventions of earlier Egyptian art. But it was Amenhotep's son who would shake Egypt to its foundations, who would attempt a revolution so radical that it would threaten the very basis of Egyptian civilization. This prince, originally named Amenhotep after his father, came to the throne around 1353 years before the Common Era. Within a few years of his accession, he changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, and he declared that the traditional gods of Egypt were false. There was only one true god, the Aten, the sun disk, whose rays ended in hands that gave life to the world. Akhenaten closed the temples of the old gods, suppressing their worship. He moved the capital from Thebes, where the powerful priests of Amun held too much influence, to a new city built on virgin ground in Middle Egypt. He called this city Akhetaten, Horizon of the Aten, and we know it today as Amarna. Here he built temples open to the sky rather than dark and enclosed like traditional Egyptian temples, places where the sun's rays could pour in unobstructed. He had himself depicted in a radically new artistic style, showing him with an elongated skull, a potbelly, wide hips, almost feminine features, so different from the idealized royal images of earlier times that scholars still debate what it means. Akhenaten's wife, Nefertiti, whose name means the beautiful one has come, was elevated to an unprecedented position, depicted alongside her husband in religious rituals, sometimes even shown in the same pose of smiting enemies that had been exclusively royal and male. Her famous bust, discovered in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose at Amarna, shows a woman of striking beauty and commanding presence, wearing the tall blue crown that was her distinctive attribute. For approximately 17 years, Akhenaten pursued his religious revolution. He wrote hymns to the Aten that are preserved on tomb walls, hymns of surprising beauty and depth that praise the sun disk as the creator and sustainer of all life. But while Akhenaten focused on religious reform, he neglected the practical business of ruling. The empire began to fray. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence preserved in the archives of Akhetaten, show foreign vassals pleading for help against invaders, complaining that their appeals are ignored, threatening to switch their allegiance to Egypt's enemies. Akhenaten, absorbed in his new religion, seems not to have cared. When Akhenaten died, his revolution died with him. His son, a boy of about 9 years old, came to the throne with the name Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten. But within a few years, the old priests and the traditional nobility had reasserted control. The boy king's name was changed to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, signaling the restoration of the old gods. The court moved back to Thebes. The city of Akhetaten was abandoned, its temples dismantled, its palaces left to decay in the desert. Akhenaten's name was struck from monuments. He became the heretic king, the criminal of Akhetaten, whose memory was to be erased. Tutankhamun himself reigned for only about 9 years before dying at around 18 years of age. The cause of his death remains uncertain, possibly disease, possibly accident, possibly murder. He would have been forgotten like so many minor pharaohs, a footnote in history, except for one thing: his tomb. While almost every other royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings was robbed in antiquity, Tutankhamun's, small and hastily prepared, was buried under debris from the excavation of later tombs and remained hidden for over 3,000 years. When Howard Carter discovered the tomb in 1922, opening its sealed door to reveal treasures undisturbed since antiquity, the world went mad for ancient Egypt. The solid gold coffin, the golden mask covering the mummy's face, the chariots and furniture and jewelry, the alabaster vases and painted chests, the thousands upon thousands of objects packed into a tomb too small to hold them comfortably. It was all there, a time capsule from the 18th dynasty, the only substantially intact royal burial ever found. Tutankhamun became the most famous pharaoh in history, not for anything he accomplished in life, but for what he left behind in death. After Tutankhamun came I, an elderly official who had served under Akhenaten and may have been related to the royal family. His reign was short, and he was followed by Horemheb, a general who had commanded Egypt's armies. Horemheb worked to erase all traces of the Amarna period, to restore order and tradition, to make Egypt strong again. When he died without an heir, he designated another general, Ramesses I, to succeed him, founding the 19th dynasty. But it was Ramesses I's grandson who would become the greatest of all the Ramessids, one of the most famous pharaohs in history. Ramesses II, who took the throne around 1279 years before the Common Era, would reign for 66 years, outlive many of his children, and leave behind more monuments than any other pharaoh. His name is everywhere in Egypt, carved on temples and statues, many of them usurped from earlier kings, but many built by him. He was the pharaoh of the biblical Exodus, according to tradition, though historical evidence for the Exodus narrative remains elusive. Early in his reign, Ramesses faced a major challenge. The Hittite Empire, based in Anatolia, modern Turkey, had become a great power, rivaling Egypt for control of Syria. In his 5th year, Ramesses led his army north to confront the Hittites at Kadesh, a strategic city on the Orontes River. According to Egyptian accounts, especially the long inscriptions Ramesses had carved on multiple temples, he was nearly defeated through Hittite trickery. The enemy ambushed part of his divided army, throwing the Egyptians into confusion. But Ramesses, with divine assistance from Amun, rallied his troops and turned potential disaster into glorious victory. The reality was probably less dramatic. The battle was likely a stalemate, with both sides claiming victory and neither achieving their objectives. But what matters is what came after. Approximately 16 years later, Egypt and the Hittites, exhausted by their long conflict and facing new threats, made peace. They signed a treaty, copies of which survive both in Egyptian hieroglyphs and in Hittite cuneiform, establishing borders, pledging mutual defense, promising to return fugitives. This was the first peace treaty in recorded history, and it was sealed by the marriage of Ramesses to a Hittite princess. The two great powers of the ancient Near East had decided that cooperation served them better than conflict. Ramesses was a prolific builder. He completed the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, a forest of 134 massive columns, the largest of them 69 feet tall and nearly 12 feet in diameter, their capitals capable of holding 100 standing men. He built his mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, on the west bank at Thebes. He built extensively in the delta, creating a new capital at Pi Ramesses. He cut temples from solid rock at Abu Simbel in Nubia, with 4 colossal seated statues of himself, each 67 feet tall, guarding the entrance. Twice a year, on dates that may correspond to his birthday and coronation, the sun's rays penetrate deep into the mountain to illuminate the statues of the gods in the inner sanctuary. Ramesses also had a large family. He had numerous wives, including Nefertiti, his beloved chief wife, for whom he built a smaller but exquisitely decorated temple at Abu Simbel beside his own. He fathered over 100 children, many of whom predeceased him during his long reign. He lived into his 90s, an extraordinary age for ancient times, and was revered as a living god by the end of his life. When he finally died and was buried in the Valley of the Kings, his mummy, which still survives and can be seen in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, showed a man who had been tall and strong, with red hair and a prominent nose, who had suffered from arthritis and dental problems in his old age, but who had dominated his age as few rulers ever have. The later Ramessid kings could not match Ramesses II's achievements. Meremptah, his 13th son, who finally inherited the throne after so many older brothers had died, faced invasions from Libyan tribes and mysterious sea peoples. He defeated them, and he left a victory stela that contains the earliest known mention of Israel outside the Bible. But Egypt's power was waning. The empire was becoming too expensive to maintain. The climate may have been changing, making agriculture less productive. The sea peoples, migrants and raiders from the Aegean and beyond, were disrupting the entire eastern Mediterranean world. By the end of the 20th dynasty, around 1070 years before the Common Era, the New Kingdom was effectively over. Egypt would never again be a great imperial power. The Valley of the Kings, that secret necropolis that had housed royal burials for 500 years, was proving not so secret after all. Tomb robbery had become endemic, with even the guards and officials supposed to protect the tombs participating in the theft. Eventually, priests gathered the remaining royal mummies and hid them in caches, where they lay undiscovered until modern times. And yet, for all that was lost, what had been achieved during the New Kingdom was extraordinary. Egypt had built an empire. Egyptian armies had marched through Syria and Palestine, bringing back tribute and establishing hegemony. Egyptian gold had flowed to foreign courts, securing alliances. Foreign princesses had married Egyptian kings. Egyptian culture had influenced and been influenced by the wider world. Art had reached new heights of refinement and naturalism. Literature, including love poetry that still moves us with its tenderness and longing, had flourished. The great temples of Karnak and Luxor had taken the forms we still admire today. The tombs in the Valley of the Kings, however plundered, still preserve paintings of breathtaking beauty, showing the pharaohs' journeys through the underworld. The New Kingdom was Egypt's last great age of independent power and cultural flowering. What came after would be marked by increasing foreign influence, eventual foreign rule, gradual decline. But for 5 centuries, during the New Kingdom, Egypt had stood at the center of the civilized world, its pharaohs respected and feared, its wealth legendary, its monuments proclaiming its glory to all who saw them. The memory of that glory would sustain Egypt through the darker times ahead, and it sustains us still today as we marvel at what this ancient civilization achieved at the height of its power. Chapter 5. Spirituality and Knowledge. The Egyptian Soul. To understand ancient Egypt, to truly grasp what made this civilization endure for 3 millennia, we must look beyond the pyramids and temples, beyond the pharaohs and their conquests, and explore the beliefs and knowledge that shaped Egyptian minds and hearts. The Egyptians were a deeply religious people, but their religion was not a separate sphere of life, confined to temples and festivals. It permeated everything: their art, their architecture, their government, their understanding of the cosmos, their hopes for the future, their daily routines. To be Egyptian was to live in a world populated by gods, where the divine and human realms constantly intersected, where magic was real and the boundary between life and death was permeable. The Egyptian pantheon was vast and complex, with hundreds of gods and goddesses worshipped throughout the land. Some were great cosmic deities known throughout Egypt. Others were local gods, important in one town or region but little known elsewhere. Many gods had multiple forms and could merge with other gods, creating composite deities whose attributes combined those of their constituent parts. This fluidity This willingness to see the divine in many forms and many places was characteristic of Egyptian religious thought. They did not seek theological consistency in the way that later monotheistic religions would. They were comfortable with contradictions, with multiple explanations for the same phenomenon, with different truths existing simultaneously. Ra, the sun god, was perhaps the most important deity in the Egyptian pantheon, at least from the Old Kingdom onward. Each morning he was born anew from the sky goddess Nut, and he sailed across the sky in his solar bark, bringing light and warmth to the world. At evening, he descended into the underworld, the Duat, where he journeyed through 12 hours of darkness, facing dangers and enemies, chief among them, the serpent Apophis, who sought to devour him and end the world. But Ra always triumphed, always emerged victorious at dawn, beginning the cycle anew. This daily journey was the most fundamental rhythm of existence, the proof that order would always defeat chaos, that light would always return after darkness. Osiris, god of the underworld and resurrection, embodied the Egyptian understanding of death and rebirth. According to the myth, Osiris had once been a king of Egypt, ruling wisely and teaching his people agriculture and civilization. But his brother Set, god of chaos and the desert, was jealous. Set murdered Osiris, dismembering his body and scattering the pieces throughout Egypt. Osiris's sister wife Isis, aided by her sister Nephthys, searched for the pieces and reassembled them. Through her powerful magic and her love, Isis restored Osiris to life. Though he could no longer remain in the world of the living, he descended to the underworld to become its ruler, the Lord of the Dead, the judge who would weigh each soul and determine its fate. From their union, Isis conceived a son, Horus, whom she raised in secret in the papyrus marshes of the Delta, protecting him from Set's murderous intentions. When Horus came of age, he challenged Set for the throne of Egypt. The contest between them lasted for years, with gods serving as judges, neither side able to gain complete victory. Eventually, Horus was declared the rightful king, and Set was assigned to dwell in the desert, the realm of chaos outside the ordered world of Egypt. Every pharaoh was understood as the living Horus, the rightful heir to the throne, maintaining the victory of order over chaos that Horus had won. Isis herself was one of Egypt's most beloved deities, worshipped as the ideal mother and wife, as a powerful magician, as a protective goddess who could heal the sick and guard the vulnerable. Her cult would eventually spread far beyond Egypt, throughout the Roman Empire, with temples to Isis built as far away as Britain. She represented the power of love and determination, the refusal to accept death as final, the belief that devotion could overcome any obstacle. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, presided over mummification and protected cemeteries. His black color represented both the black soil of Egypt and the color of decomposed flesh, symbolizing regeneration and rebirth. He was the guide who led the dead through the underworld, who stood beside Osiris during the weighing of the heart, who ensured that the proper rituals were performed. Far from being frightening, Anubis was a comforting presence, the guardian who ensured that the transition from life to death proceeded correctly. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and the moon, was the divine scribe who recorded the verdict when each soul was judged. He was the patron of scribes, inventors of writing and counting, masters of magic and medicine. The Egyptians believed that Thoth had given them hieroglyphs, that sacred script that allowed knowledge to be preserved and transmitted across generations. In the quiet hours of night, when the moon sailed across the sky, Thoth kept watch, measuring time, recording the deeds of humans and gods alike. Hathor, often depicted as a cow or a woman with cow's ears, was the goddess of love, joy, music, and dance. She was the divine mother who nurtured all living things, but she also had a fierce aspect, transforming into the lioness Sekhmet when her anger was roused. The Egyptians understood that the forces of nature and divinity contained both nurturing and destructive potential, that the same goddess who gave life could also take it away. Ma'at was not just a goddess but a concept, the fundamental principle that held the universe together. Ma'at meant truth, justice, harmony, balance, order. It was Ma'at that kept the sun rising, the Nile flooding, society functioning. The pharaoh's most important duty was to maintain Ma'at, to prevent the chaos, known as Isfet, from overwhelming the ordered world. Every act of justice, every proper ritual, every offering made to the gods, every true word spoken, strengthened Ma'at. Conversely, every crime, every lie, every failure to fulfill one's duties, weakened it and allowed chaos to encroach. This concept of Ma'at extended to the Egyptian understanding of the afterlife and divine judgment. When a person died, their soul would journey through the underworld, facing various challenges and dangers, before finally arriving at the Hall of Two Truths. Here, before Osiris and 42 divine judges, the deceased would make what is known as the negative confession, declaring all the sins they had not committed. Then came the crucial moment, the weighing of the heart. The heart, which the Egyptians believed was the seat of emotion, memory, and moral character, would be placed on one side of a scale. On the other side was a feather, the symbol of Ma'at. Anubis operated the scales while Thoth stood ready to record the result. If the heart was light, unburdened by sin and wrongdoing, balanced with Ma'at, the deceased would be declared justified and admitted to the field of reeds, a paradise where life continued much as it had in Egypt, but without hardship or sorrow, where the harvests were always abundant and existence was eternally pleasant. But if the heart was heavy with sin, weighed down by evil deeds and unjust actions, it would outweigh the feather. In that terrible moment, the heart would be fed to Ammit, a composite monster with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, all animals that Egyptians feared. Ammit would devour the sinful heart, and the person would experience the second death, true annihilation, ceasing to exist in any form. This was the ultimate terror for the Egyptians, not torment or punishment but complete obliteration, as if they had never been. This belief in divine judgment based on moral behavior had profound implications. It meant that one's fate in the afterlife depended not merely on proper burial and knowing the right spells, though those certainly helped, but on how one had lived, on whether one had acted justly, spoken truthfully, treated others fairly. The democratization of access to the afterlife during the Middle Kingdom meant that this moral dimension applied to everyone, not just the elite. Every Egyptian, from the pharaoh to the humblest farmer, would face the same judgment, would have their heart weighed against the same feather of Ma'at. The process of preparing for the afterlife began the moment death occurred. The body would be taken to the place of embalming, the pernefa, or beautiful house, where specialized priests would perform the rituals of mummification. This was a sacred process, protected by religious rituals and magical spells, designed to preserve the body so that the Ka, the spiritual double of the deceased, would have a physical home to which it could return. The actual procedure took 70 days to complete. First, the brain was removed through the nose using long hooks, though the Egyptians did not understand the brain's importance and simply discarded it. Then an incision was made in the left side of the abdomen, and the internal organs, except for the heart, were removed. The heart was left in place because it would be needed for judgment in the afterlife. The removed organs, the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines, were treated, wrapped, and placed in 4 canopic jars, each protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus. The body cavity was washed and filled with natron, a naturally occurring salt that would dry out the tissues. The body was also covered with natron on the outside. It would remain packed in natron for 40 days, after which the natron would be removed. The body cavity would be filled with linen or sawdust to restore its shape, and the incision would be sealed with a plate, often bearing an image of the Wedjat eye, the eye of Horus, a powerful protective symbol. The final stage was wrapping. The body would be wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen strips, with amulets and protective charms placed between the layers. Each finger and toe might be individually wrapped. The wrapping process could take 15 days. Throughout the procedure, priests would recite spells from the Book of the Dead, ensuring that the deceased would have the magical protection needed for the dangerous journey through the underworld. The Book of the Dead, or more accurately the Book of Coming Forth by Day, as the Egyptians called it, was not a single book, but a collection of spells, prayers, and instructions that evolved over centuries. Extracts from it would be written on papyrus and placed with the mummy, or painted on the walls of the tomb, or inscribed on coffins and funerary equipment. These spells served various purposes. Some protected the deceased from dangers in the underworld. Some provided magical passwords needed to pass certain gates or challenges, Some transformed the deceased into various forms. Some ensured they would not hunger or thirst. Some declared their innocence and worthiness to enter the afterlife. One of the most important spells was Chapter 1:25, the negative confession and the weighing of the heart. It provided the deceased with the words to speak before the divine judges, listing the sins they had not committed. I have not killed, I have not stolen, I have not told lies, I have not committed adultery, I have not cheated in measures of grain, I have not taken milk from the mouths of children, and so on through 42 declarations, one for each divine judge. These declarations reveal what the Egyptians considered important: justice, honesty, respect for others' property and lives, proper behavior in sexual matters, care for the vulnerable. The tomb itself was understood as a house for eternity, a place where the deceased would dwell forever. In the Old Kingdom, the tombs of nobles were decorated with scenes of daily life: farming, fishing, hunting, feasting, entertainment. These were not merely decorations but magical images that would become reality in the afterlife. If bread and beer were painted on the wall, the deceased would have bread and beer. If cattle were shown, the deceased would possess cattle. If servants were depicted working, those servants would work for the deceased throughout eternity. By the New Kingdom, tomb decoration had shifted somewhat, with more emphasis on religious scenes, the deceased worshipping gods, the journey through the underworld, depictions of the Book of the Dead spells, images of the Field of Reeds. The tombs of the pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings were covered with intricate paintings showing the books of the underworld, the Amduat, the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns, complex religious texts describing the sun god's nightly journey and the deceased pharaoh's identification with that journey. But the Egyptians were not only concerned with death and the afterlife, they were equally interested in understanding and manipulating the world of the living. Egyptian knowledge, Egyptian science, if we can call it that, was always practical, focused on solving real problems and achieving useful results. They did not develop abstract theories for their own sake, but they accumulated vast practical knowledge through centuries of careful observation and experimentation. In medicine, the Egyptians were remarkably advanced. Surviving medical papyri describe treatments for a wide range of ailments, from wounds and fractures to eye diseases and digestive problems. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 years before the Common Era, though copied from an even older text, is a surgical handbook describing 48 cases of injuries, mostly to the head and torso, each with a title, examination procedure, diagnosis, and treatment recommendation. The approach is largely rational and empirical, recommending treatments like sutures, splints, and cauterization, though magical spells are also included as additional protection. Egyptian doctors recognize different levels of severity in injuries, using categories that translate as an ailment I will treat, an ailment I will contend with, and an ailment not to be treated, meaning a fatal case. They understood that the heart was central to circulation, that the pulse could provide diagnostic information, that the brain was somehow connected to the control of the body. They performed surgery, including trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, possibly to relieve pressure or treat head injuries. They set broken bones, using splints padded with linen. They had dental knowledge, performing extractions and treating abscesses. Their pharmaceutical knowledge was extensive. The Ebers Papyrus lists hundreds of prescriptions using plant, animal, and mineral ingredients. Many of these remedies probably had genuine therapeutic value. Honey, used frequently in Egyptian medicine, has antibacterial properties. Willow bark, containing salicylic acid, would have had pain-relieving and anti-inflammatory effects. Some remedies seem less promising to modern eyes, such as treatments involving crocodile dung or ground-up precious stones, but even these reflect sophisticated ideas about the properties of different substances. In mathematics, the Egyptians developed a practical system adequate for their needs in architecture, engineering, surveying, and accounting. They used a decimal system, though without place value or a zero. They could perform addition and subtraction easily, and they had methods for multiplication and division, though these were based on doubling and halving rather than our modern multiplication tables. They understood fractions, though they preferred unit fractions with 1 as the numerator. They could calculate areas of rectangles, triangles, and circles, though their approximation of pi was slightly inaccurate at about 3.16 compared to the true value of approximately 3.14159. The Rind mathematical papyrus, dating to around 1650 years before the Common Era, contains 84 mathematical problems with solutions, covering practical matters like calculating the amount of grain needed to make a certain amount of beer, determining the slope of a pyramid, dividing loaves of bread among workers in different ratios, and calculating the capacity of cylindrical granaries. These problems reveal the mathematical challenges that Egyptian administrators and architects faced daily and the methods they used to solve them. Egyptian astronomy was closely tied to practical concerns, particularly agriculture and the calendar. They recognized 5 planets, which they called the stars that know no rest, distinguishing them from the fixed stars. They identified constellations and used the heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, to predict the coming of the Nile flood. They developed a calendar of 365 days, divided into 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 additional days considered unlucky. This was remarkably close to the true solar year of 365 and 1/4 days, though the lack of a leap year meant their calendar slowly drifted out of sync with the seasons. They measured time during the day using shadow clocks and sundials, and during the night using star clocks or water clocks, vessels from which water would drip at a constant rate, with markings inside showing the passage of hours. The Egyptian hour, unlike our modern hour, varied in length depending on the season, since they divided both day and night into 12 hours, regardless of the actual length of daylight or darkness. In technology and engineering, the Egyptians demonstrated remarkable capability. Their achievements in stoneworking are evident in every pyramid, temple, and statue they left behind. They quarried granite from Aswan, limestone from Tura, alabaster from Hatnub, moving blocks weighing many tons using copper tools, wooden sledges, and organized human labor. They carved statues of extraordinary precision and finish, including the colossal figures like those at Abu Simbel. They understood levers and ramps, though they never developed the pulley or the wheel for transportation, relying instead on sledges that distributed weight and could be pulled over sand or rolling logs. Egyptian metallurgy progressed from copper in the early periods to bronze in the Middle Kingdom, when they learned to alloy copper with tin, creating a harder metal suitable for tools and weapons. They worked with gold extensively, Egypt being rich in gold from Nubian mines. They developed techniques for gilding, for creating gold leaf thin enough to cover large surfaces, for inlaying gold into other materials. They made jewelry of exquisite delicacy, glass vessels and beads, faience, a glazed ceramic material that could be molded and fired to create objects in brilliant blue and green. In agriculture, the foundation of Egyptian civilization, they developed sophisticated irrigation techniques. The basin irrigation system involved dividing the floodplain into basins surrounded by earthen banks. When the flood came, water would be channeled into these basins and held there for weeks, allowing the silt to settle and the ground to become thoroughly saturated. After the water was drained back into the river or into lower basins, planting could begin in the fertile, moist soil. This system, unchanged in its essentials for thousands of years, made Egypt one of the most productive agricultural regions in the ancient world. The Egyptians grew wheat and barley as their staple crops, processing them into bread and beer, the fundamental elements of the Egyptian diet. They grew flax for linen, the primary textile. They cultivated vegetables, including onions, lettuce, cucumbers, and lentils. They grew fruits, including dates, figs, and grapes. They raised cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and domestic fowl. They fished in the Nile and hunted wild birds in the marshes. The abundance of food that this agricultural system produced supported the large non-farming population of priests, officials, scribes, craftsmen, and soldiers that characterized Egyptian civilization, but perhaps the most important Egyptian intellectual achievement was writing. Hieroglyphs, those distinctive pictorial signs that we associate immediately with ancient Egypt, were more than just a writing system. They were sacred symbols, the writing of the gods, as the Egyptians called them. They were beautiful in themselves, miniature works of art, whether carved in stone or painted on papyrus. They could be read in multiple directions, left to right to left, or top to bottom, with the orientation of human and animal figures indicating which way to read. The hieroglyphic script included several hundred signs representing sounds, ideas, or categories. Some signs were phonetic, representing single consonants or consonant clusters. Others were ideograms or determinatives, indicating what category of thing was meant. The system was complex and took years to master, which is why scribes held such high status in Egyptian society. They were the educated elite, the bureaucrats who made the administration function, the record keepers who documented everything from tax receipts to royal decrees to religious rituals. For everyday use, the Egyptians developed simplified scripts. Hieratic, a cursive form of hieroglyphs, was used for most documents on papyrus or ostraca, broken pottery shards used as cheap writing surfaces. Later, an even more simplified script called demotic emerged, used for business and legal documents. But hieroglyphs remained the script of choice for monuments and religious texts, maintaining their sacred and formal character throughout Egyptian history. This accumulated knowledge, this rich tradition of learning and craftsmanship, was not merely technical, but deeply embedded in Egyptian culture and worldview. Science and magic, in the Egyptian mind, were not separate categories. Both were ways of understanding and controlling reality. Both relied on knowing the right procedures and speaking the right words. A medical treatment might combine a rational remedy, like binding a wound, with a magical spell invoking divine protection. An architectural project would involve both careful calculation and religious rituals to ensure divine favor. Knowledge was power, but power was also knowledge, and both were gifts from the gods, to be used wisely in service of Ma'at, maintaining the order and harmony that made civilization possible. Chapter 6. Decline and Foreign Invasions. The Third Intermediate Period, beginning around 1070 years before the Common Era, marked the end of Egypt's time as an independent great power. The unified kingdom that had endured for nearly 2 millennia began to fragment once again. The pharaohs who ruled from Tanis in the delta no longer commanded the resources or authority of their new kingdom predecessors. In Thebes, the high priests of Amun wielded power that rivaled or even exceeded that of the nominal kings in the north. Egypt was divided not by foreign invasion but by the slow dissolution of central authority, by the rise of regional powers who owed only nominal allegiance to whoever claimed the title of pharaoh. This was not a sudden collapse, not a dramatic ending like the fall of the Old Kingdom. Rather, it was a gradual fading, a slow twilight where the structures of pharaonic power remained in place, but their substance drained away. The priests of Amun at Thebes had grown wealthy and powerful over centuries of royal donations and endowments. By the end of the New Kingdom, they controlled vast estates, employed thousands of workers, and commanded resources that made them effectively independent rulers of Upper Egypt. The high priest Herihor, who held office at the end of the 20th dynasty, took royal titles and had himself depicted in royal regalia, though he never claimed to be pharaoh of all Egypt. In the north, a new dynasty arose, the 21st, ruling from Tanis in the delta. These kings maintained the forms of pharaonic rule, building temples, corresponding with foreign powers, claiming sovereignty over all Egypt. But their actual control rarely extended much beyond Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt remained under the authority of the high priests of Amun, who married into the royal family and maintained an uneasy coexistence with their northern counterparts. Egypt was once again divided, though this time the division was not between rival claimants to the throne, but between a weak kingship in the north and a powerful priesthood in the south, both claiming legitimacy, neither strong enough to unite the country by force. Meanwhile, new peoples were entering Egypt. Libyans from the western desert had been settling in the delta for generations, first as mercenaries and settlers, gradually becoming more numerous and influential. By the 22nd dynasty, Libya had effectively taken control of the Egyptian throne, though they ruled as pharaohs, adopting Egyptian titles and traditions, continuing the forms of pharaonic civilization even as they brought new blood and new ideas into the ancient kingdom. The most successful of these Libyan pharaohs was Shoshenq I, who came to power around 945 years before the Common Era. He worked to restore unity to Egypt, bringing both Tanis and Thebes under his control, reforming the administration, and even launching military campaigns abroad, reminiscent of the New Kingdom conquests. His campaign into Palestine is mentioned in the Bible, where he is called Shishak and described as attacking Jerusalem during the reign of Solomon's son Rehoboam, carrying off treasures from the temple. For a brief moment, it seemed Egypt might recover its former power and glory. But Shoshenq's achievements did not outlast his immediate successors. His son Osorkon II maintained control over a united Egypt, but after his death the kingdom fragmented again, this time more thoroughly than before. Multiple rulers claimed the title of pharaoh, each controlling only a portion of Egypt. By the middle of the 8th century before the Common Era, Egypt was divided into several competing kingdoms, dynasties ruling simultaneously from Tanis, Sais, Leontopolis, Hermopolis, Heracleopolis, and of course, Thebes. The two lands were not merely divided in two but shattered into many pieces, each going its own way. Into this fragmented and weakened Egypt came a new power from the south. The kingdom of Kush, in what is now Sudan, had long been under Egyptian influence, ruled by Egyptianized elites who worshipped Egyptian gods, wrote in Egyptian hieroglyphs, and saw themselves as the true inheritors of pharaonic tradition. The Kushite king Kashta, ruling around 750 years before the Common Era, looked north at the divided lands of Egypt and saw an opportunity. He advanced into Upper Egypt, taking control of Thebes without significant resistance, presenting himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the restorer of proper Egyptian rule, the champion of Amun against the divided and weak kings of the north. Kashta's son Piye, or Pianki, as he is sometimes called, completed what his father had begun. Around 747 years before the Common Era, he launched a full-scale invasion of Egypt, marching north with a large army. The local kings of Middle and Lower Egypt formed a coalition to resist him, but they were defeated in a series of battles and sieges. Piye's own account of the campaign, recorded on a victory stela found at the sacred mountain of Gebel Barkal in Nubia, describes how he captured city after city, how the kings of Egypt came to him in submission, how he entered Memphis, and was crowned as pharaoh in the proper Egyptian manner. Piye saw himself as liberating Egypt, restoring it to proper rule after generations of division and decline. He was devoutly religious, more concerned with ensuring that proper rituals were performed in the temples than with extracting tribute or imposing foreign rule. After securing his conquest and receiving the submission of all the major kings and princes of Egypt, Piye returned to Nubia, leaving the local rulers in place provided they acknowledged his supremacy. He had united Egypt, but it was a loose unity, and the conquered kings, given the chance, would surely try to reassert their independence. It fell to Piye's successor, Shabaka, to establish more direct Kushite control over Egypt. Shabaka crushed a revolt, executed one of the rebellious kings, and established a firmer Kushite administration. He and his successors, the 25th dynasty, ruled Egypt for over half a century, from approximately 712 to 664 years before the Common Era. They were perhaps the most Egyptian of any foreign rulers Egypt would ever know, more devoted to Egyptian religion and tradition than the recent native dynasties had been. They built and restored temples, revived artistic styles from the Old and Middle Kingdoms, saw themselves as returning Egypt to its ancient glory. But the Kushite pharaohs faced a problem their predecessors had not: the rise of Assyria. The Assyrian Empire, based in northern Mesopotamia, was the superpower of the age, possessing the most formidable military machine the ancient world had yet seen. The Assyrians had conquered Syria and Palestine, the traditional buffer zone between Egypt and Mesopotamia, and now they stood on Egypt's borders. The Kushite pharaohs tried to resist, sending aid to rebellious Syrian princes, forming alliances against Assyrian expansion. But they were no match for Assyrian military might. In 671 years before the Common Era, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt, defeating the Kushite pharaoh Taharqa and occupying Memphis. Taharqa retreated to Thebes and continued to resist, but in 667, Esarhaddon's successor Ashurbanipal invaded again, this time pursuing Taharqa all the way to Thebes. The great city that had been Egypt's religious capital for over 1,000 years was sacked, its temples plundered, its monuments desecrated. The memory of that destruction would haunt Egypt. The prophet Nahum, writing decades later about the fall of the Assyrian capital Nineveh, would ask, "Are you better than Thebes, that was situated by the Nile, surrounded by water. The Kushite rulers were driven back to Nubia, where they continued to rule an independent kingdom and maintain pharaonic traditions for centuries to come. In Egypt, the Assyrians installed native Egyptian princes as vassals, granting them local authority, provided they paid tribute and acknowledged Assyrian overlordship. Chief among these vassals was Psamtik, Prince of Sais in the western delta, who would prove more capable and ambitious than the Assyrians anticipated. As Assyrian power became overextended, as they faced rebellions and difficulties in other parts of their vast empire, Psamtik gradually asserted his independence. By 656 years before the Common Era, he had unified Egypt under his rule, founding the 26th dynasty and beginning what historians call the Saite period, a final flowering of native Egyptian rule before the coming of Persian conquest. Psamtik I ruled for 54 years, long enough to establish a stable government, restore Egypt's economy, and revive something of its former prestige. The Saite pharaohs looked to the past for inspiration, deliberately reviving artistic styles and religious practices from earlier periods, particularly the Old Kingdom. This archaism was not mere nostalgia, but a conscious effort to reconnect with Egypt's glorious past, to demonstrate continuity with the great ages of pyramid builders and empire builders. Artists carved reliefs in the style of the Old Kingdom. Priests composed texts modeled on ancient prototypes. The Saite period produced works of remarkable technical virtuosity, though some scholars see in them a certain coldness, a perfection of technique that lacks the vitality of earlier periods. Psamtik and his successors also opened Egypt to the outside world in new ways. Greek mercenaries served in the Egyptian army. Greek traders established settlements in the delta. The pharaoh Necho II, Psamtik's son, attempted to dig a canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea, though the project was never completed. He sent a Phoenician expedition to circumnavigate Africa, and according to Herodotus, they succeeded, taking 3 years to sail from the Red Sea around the southern tip of Africa and back through the Pillars of Heracles, though many scholars doubt this account. Necho also confronted the rising power of Babylon, which had destroyed the Assyrian Empire and inherited its territories. At the Battle of Carchemish, in 605 years before the Common Era, the Egyptian army was decisively defeated by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar. Egypt's brief resurgence as a major power was over. The pharaohs of the 26th dynasty would rule for another 70 years, maintaining independence and even a degree of prosperity, but always in the shadow of greater powers to the east. The last great pharaoh of the Saite period was Ramesses, who ruled from 570 to 526 years before the Common Era. He was a commoner who seized the throne in a military coup but proved an effective and popular ruler. He reformed the government, stimulated trade, maintained good relations with the Greek city-states, and continued the building projects that demonstrated pharaonic power and piety. Egypt, under Ramesses, was prosperous and stable, the last calm before the storm. When Ramesses died, his son Psamtik III inherited a kingdom about to face its greatest challenge yet. The Persian Empire, which had conquered Media, Lydia, and Babylon, now turned its attention to Egypt. In 525 years before the Common Era, the Persian king Cambyses invaded. The Egyptian army met the Persians at Pelusium, the gateway to Egypt, and was utterly defeated. Psamtik was captured, briefly kept alive by Cambyses, then executed. The 26th dynasty, the last native dynasty to rule an independent Egypt, was over. Egypt became a province of the Persian Empire, governed by a satrap appointed by the Persian king. Cambyses took the title of pharaoh and had himself portrayed in Egyptian style on some monuments, but he reportedly treated Egyptian religion with contempt, killing the sacred Apis bull and mocking Egyptian gods. Whether these stories are true or Persian propaganda by later Egyptian sources is unclear, but they reflected Egyptian resentment at foreign rule. Some Persian kings treated Egypt more respectfully. Darius I visited Egypt, completed Necho's canal to the Red Sea, restored temples, and presented himself as a proper pharaoh continuing ancient traditions. His inscriptions at the Temple of Hybis in the Karga oasis show him making offerings to Egyptian gods in traditional pharaonic style. Under Darius, Egypt was relatively prosperous and peaceful, though the heavy taxation required to support the vast Persian Empire was a constant burden. But Persian rule was never popular, and Egypt rebelled whenever it seemed the Persians were distracted or weakened. In 460 years before the Common Era, a major revolt broke out, led by a Libyan prince named Inaros, with support from Athens. The revolt initially succeeded, with Inaros controlling much of the delta and besieging Memphis. But Persian reinforcements eventually arrived, and after 6 years of fighting, the rebellion was crushed and Inaros was executed. Yet hope never died. In 404 years before the Common Era, as the Persian Empire faced difficulties elsewhere, Egypt successfully revolted again. Native Egyptian dynasties, the 28th, 29th, and 30th, ruled independently for 60 years. The most successful of these later pharaohs was Nectanebo I, who ruled from 380 to 362 years before the Common Era, and Nectanebo II, who ruled from 360 to 343. These kings built extensively, adding to temples throughout Egypt, demonstrating that pharaonic power and tradition continued despite everything. Nectanebo II was the last native Egyptian to rule Egypt as pharaoh. In 343 years before the Common Era, the Persians invaded again under Artaxerxes III. This time there would be no quick expulsion. Nectanebo fled south, perhaps hoping to continue resistance from Upper Egypt, but he vanished from history. The Persians imposed harsh rule, plundering temples and suppressing any hint of rebellion. This second period of Persian rule was even less popular than the first had been. But Persian domination would prove brief. A new power was rising in the west, one that would change the entire eastern Mediterranean world. Philip of Macedon had united the Greek city-states under his rule, and his son Alexander was about to embark on the conquest of the Persian Empire itself. In 332 years before the Common Era, Alexander entered Egypt, and the Egyptians, who had no love for Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. Alexander visited the Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis in the western desert, where the god supposedly confirmed that he was the son of Amun, giving him divine sanction to rule Egypt. He founded the city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, which would become one of the great cities of the ancient world, a center of Greek culture and learning. But Alexander did not stay long in Egypt. He had an empire to conquer, and after less than a year, he departed, leaving Egypt under the administration of Macedonian governors. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 years before the Common Era at the age of only 32, his vast empire immediately began to fragment as his generals fought over the pieces. One of those generals, Ptolemy, secured control of Egypt and eventually declared himself pharaoh, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 300 years, the last dynasty before the final end of pharaonic civilization. The Ptolemies were Greeks, speaking Greek, following Greek customs, ruling over a Greek administrative elite that they settled in Egypt. But they understood the importance of Egyptian religion and tradition to maintaining legitimacy. They presented themselves as pharaohs, built temples in Egyptian style, sponsored Egyptian cults, and had themselves portrayed in Egyptian art, following all the traditional conventions. They were crowned according to Egyptian ritual. They took Egyptian throne names. They maintained the fiction that they were Egyptian rulers, even as they were thoroughly Greek in language and culture. Under Ptolemaic rule, Alexandria became the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world. The Great Library of Alexandria, founded by Ptolemy I or his son, Ptolemy II, aimed to collect all the knowledge in the world, eventually holding hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Scholars from throughout the Greek world came to Alexandria to study, conduct research, and participate in debates at the museum, the Temple of the Muses that served as the ancient world's first research institute. It was in Alexandria that Euclid systematized geometry, that Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy, that the Hebrew Bible was first translated into Greek, creating the Septuagint. The early Ptolemies were capable rulers who maintained Egypt's prosperity and even expanded its influence, controlling Cyprus, parts of coastal Syria, and various Aegean islands. But as the dynasty continued, the quality of its rulers declined. Palace intrigues, murderous power struggles within the royal family, and conflicts with the rising power of Rome gradually weakened Ptolemaic Egypt. By the 1st century before the Common Era, Egypt was effectively a client state of Rome, its independence more nominal than real, its survival dependent on Roman goodwill. The last of the Ptolemies, the famous Cleopatra VII, would fight desperately to maintain Egyptian independence and her own power. But she would fail, and with her failure, 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization would finally come to an end. The story of Cleopatra and the final years of independent Egypt deserves its own telling, a last chapter before the ancient world gave way to the new order of Roman domination. But that tale comes next, the final act in the long drama that began when Narmer united the two lands and took the double crown so many centuries before. Chapter 7. Cleopatra and the End. By the time Cleopatra was born, around 69 years before the Common Era, Egypt was a shadow of its former self. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled for 2.5 centuries, but the great days were long past. Rome had become the dominant power in the Mediterranean, and the Ptolemies survived only through Roman patronage, their kingdom a valuable prize that Rome did not yet choose to claim directly, but kept as a wealthy client state. The royal court at Alexandria was a place of intrigue and violence, where siblings murdered each other for the throne, where dynastic marriages between brothers and sisters produced weak and dissolute rulers, where the gap between the Greek elite and the native Egyptian population remained unbridged. Cleopatra was different from her predecessors in one crucial respect: she bothered to learn Egyptian. The Ptolemies had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries without mastering the language of their subjects, conducting all business in Greek, relating to Egypt's ancient culture only through the necessity of appearing in temples and being depicted in Egyptian artistic style. But Cleopatra, who according to ancient sources spoke 8 or 9 languages fluently, understood that Egypt was more than just a source of wealth to be exploited. She presented herself not merely as a Greek queen ruling Egypt, but as a pharaoh in the ancient tradition, the daughter of Ra, the living Isis. She came to power at 17 or 18 years of age, initially ruling jointly with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, whom she was married to following Ptolemaic custom. But the arrangement broke down quickly. The powerful officials who surrounded the young king tried to sideline Cleopatra, viewing her as a threat to their influence. A power struggle ensued, and within 2 years, Cleopatra had been driven from Alexandria, forced to flee to Syria, where she gathered an army of mercenaries to fight for her throne. It was at this moment, when Egypt teetered on the brink of civil war, that Julius Caesar arrived. Rome itself was in the midst of civil war, with Caesar pursuing his rival Pompey the Great across the Mediterranean. Pompey fled to Egypt seeking refuge, but the advisors of young Ptolemy, hoping to curry favor with Caesar, murdered Pompey and presented his severed head to Caesar when he arrived. Caesar was horrified rather than pleased, weeping at the death of his former ally and son-in-law, even though they had become enemies. He took up residence in the royal palace at Alexandria, nominally to arbitrate the dispute between Cleopatra and her brother. According to the famous story, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into the palace, rolled up in a carpet or perhaps a linen sack, and dramatically revealed herself to Caesar. She was young, intelligent, charming, and she needed Caesar's support to regain her throne. Caesar was 52, at the height of his power, the most successful general and politician Rome had produced in generations. What began as a political alliance quickly became something more personal. Caesar took Cleopatra's side in the dispute, declaring that she and Ptolemy should rule jointly as he had originally been instructed by their father's will. Ptolemy's advisors, realizing that Caesar meant to restore Cleopatra's power, raised the populace of Alexandria against the Romans. The Alexandrian War that followed lasted several months, with Caesar and his small force besieged in the palace quarter. At one point, fighting spread to the harbour and fire broke out, possibly damaging part of the Great Library of Alexandria, though the extent of the destruction is debated by scholars. Eventually, Roman reinforcements arrived, and in a decisive battle, Caesar defeated Ptolemy's forces. The young king fled, supposedly drowning in the Nile when his boat capsized, though his body was never found with certainty. Cleopatra was restored to power, now ruling jointly with an even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, but clearly the dominant partner. She had become Caesar's mistress, and soon she was pregnant. The child, a son, would be called Ptolemy Caesar, though everyone called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. Ancient sources differ on whether Caesar acknowledged the boy as his son, but Cleopatra certainly presented him as such, and Caesar never publicly denied paternity. Caesar remained in Egypt for several months, far longer than military necessity required. He and Cleopatra took a pleasure cruise up the Nile, sailing in a magnificent barge, viewing the ancient monuments. For Caesar, it must have been like traveling through a living museum, seeing monuments already 2,000 years old or more, pyramids that had stood for twice as long as Rome had existed. For Cleopatra, it was a demonstration of her legitimacy, showing the Roman conqueror the antiquity and grandeur of the civilization she ruled. Eventually, Caesar had to return to his wars and his politics. He left Egypt, but he had given Cleopatra what she needed: security on her throne, and a son who might someday inherit not just Egypt, but perhaps something more. When Caesar returned to Rome, Cleopatra followed a year later, taking up residence in one of his villas across the Tiber. She was in Rome when Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March, the 15th of March, in 44 years before the Common Era. The news must have been devastating. Her protector was dead, and she was in a foreign city that had never been entirely comfortable with her presence. She returned to Egypt as quickly as possible. Rome descended into civil war again, with Caesar's assassins opposed by his supporters, chief among them Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal officer and friend, and Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew whom Caesar had adopted as his heir in his will. Cleopatra had to navigate this dangerous situation carefully. Egypt was wealthy, a prize that all sides would want to secure. She needed to choose the winning side but could not be certain which side that would be. The decision became clearer after the Battle of Philippi in 42 years before the Common Era, where Antony and Octavian defeated Caesar's assassins. The Roman world was divided between them, with Antony taking the east and Octavian the west. Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus in Cilicia, ostensibly to answer questions about her loyalty during the civil war, but really to secure Egypt's support and resources for his planned campaigns against Parthia. Cleopatra made that meeting an unforgettable theatrical performance. She sailed up the river to Tarsus in a barge with gilded stern and purple sails, rowed by oars of silver. She reclined beneath a canopy embroidered with gold, dressed as Venus, the goddess of love, while boys dressed as Cupids fanned her, and her most beautiful servants, dressed as sea nymphs, worked the oars. Perfumed smoke rose from incense burners. Musicians played. It was a spectacle designed to awe and seduce, and it worked. Antony was captivated. He was 42 years old, a successful general and politician, handsome, charming, generous to his friends, popular with his soldiers. He was also somewhat self-indulgent, fond of feasting and drinking, more interested in enjoying life than in the grinding work of administration. Cleopatra, now 28, was sophisticated, intelligent, experienced in the ways of power. They were drawn to each other, and what began as a political alliance became a genuine partnership, and, it seems, a genuine love affair. Antony spent the winter of 41 to 40 years before the Common Era in Alexandria with Cleopatra, living a life of luxury and pleasure. They formed a club they called the Inimitable Livers, devoted to extravagant banquets and entertainments. Stories, probably exaggerated, circulated about the expense and excess of their feasts. But Antony could not ignore his responsibilities forever. He returned to Roman affairs, even marrying Octavian's sister Octavia to seal their political alliance, though he would soon abandon her to return to Cleopatra. Cleopatra bore Antony twins, a boy and a girl, named Alexander Helios, sun, and Cleopatra Selene, moon. Later, she would bear him a third child, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Antony acknowledged all three as his children and made grand declarations about their future kingdoms. In a ceremony in Alexandria known as the Donations of Alexandria, he proclaimed Cleopatra Queen of Kings and Caesarion King of Kings. He assigned territories throughout the eastern Mediterranean to Cleopatra and their children, treating Rome's eastern provinces as if they were his personal property to distribute as he pleased. This was too much for Octavian, who saw an opportunity to destroy his rival. He launched a propaganda campaign in Rome, painting Antony as a man who had abandoned his Roman identity and his Roman wife for an Eastern queen, who was wasting Rome's resources on foreign luxuries, who planned to make Cleopatra Queen of Rome and move the capital to Alexandria. Much of this was exaggeration, or outright fabrication, but it was effective. Roman public opinion turned against Antony. In 32 years before the Common Era, Octavian convinced the Roman Senate to declare war, not on Antony directly, which would have been civil war, but on Cleopatra, framing the conflict as Rome defending itself against a foreign threat. Antony, loyal to Cleopatra, had no choice but to fight on her side. The final confrontation came at Actium, off the western coast of Greece, on September 2nd, 31 years before the Common Era. The battle involved hundreds of warships, Octavian's fleet commanded by his brilliant admiral Agrippa facing the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The details of what happened are debated, but the outcome is clear. At some point during the battle, Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships raised their sails and withdrew, heading for the open sea. Antony, seeing her leave, abandoned his own fleet and followed her with a few ships. His remaining forces, leaderless and confused, surrendered to Octavian. Antony's cause was lost. Whether Cleopatra's withdrawal was a planned retreat or panic, whether Antony was right to follow her or should have stayed with his fleet, these questions have been debated for 2,000 years. What matters is that Octavian had won, and Antony and Cleopatra had lost. They fled back to Egypt, but they knew Octavian would follow. There was no escape, no hope of negotiation, no future except defeat and death. They spent the winter of 31 to 30 years before the Common Era in Alexandria, trying to prepare defences that they both knew were futile. They formed a new club, replacing the inimitable Livers with the partners in death. The time for pleasure and optimism was over. They were waiting for the end. Octavian arrived in Egypt in the summer of 30 years before the Common Era. His army advanced on Alexandria from the east. Antony led a force out to meet them, and to his surprise, he won a small cavalry skirmish. For a moment, hope flickered. But the next day, when battle was joined again, Antony's fleet deserted to Octavian, and his cavalry followed. His infantry, surrounded and outnumbered, had no choice but to surrender. Antony fled back to Alexandria and received false news that Cleopatra was dead, that she had killed herself in her tomb. In despair, he fell on his sword in the traditional Roman manner for a defeated general. But he botched it, mortally wounding himself but not dying immediately. Then came word that Cleopatra was alive, that she had taken refuge in her mausoleum but was not dead. Antony begged to be carried to her. His servants brought him to the mausoleum, and since Cleopatra had barricaded herself inside and refused to open the doors, they had to hoist the dying man up and lower him through a window. He died in her arms. Cleopatra was now alone, her protector dead, her city occupied by Roman soldiers. Octavian sent messengers assuring her of good treatment, but she must have known she had nothing to hope for from him. If she surrendered, she would be taken to Rome in chains to walk in Octavian's triumph, paraded through the streets for the Roman mob to jeer at, the ultimate humiliation for a queen who had ruled Egypt for 22 years, who had been the lover of two of Rome's greatest men, who had dreamed of a different future, where East and West merged into something new. She negotiated for time, possibly hoping to arrange for her children's safety, possibly planning her own end. On August the 10th or 12th, 30 years before the Common Era, Octavian's men broke into the mausoleum to secure her before she could harm herself. They were too late. Cleopatra was dead, dressed in her royal regalia, lying on a golden couch. Her two handmaidens were dying beside her. The method of her death remains uncertain. Tradition says she died from the bite of an asp, a small poisonous snake smuggled to her in a basket of figs. But some ancient sources and many modern scholars doubt this, suggesting she might have used poison concealed in a hairpin or some other small object. However it was accomplished, she had denied Octavian his triumph, had died by her own choice, in her own manner, maintaining her dignity and her sovereignty to the very end. Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, was hunted down and killed as he tried to flee Egypt. Octavian could not afford to leave alive anyone who might claim to be Caesar's true heir. The children she had with Antony were spared and taken to Rome to be raised by Octavian's wife, Antony's abandoned wife Octavia, in a gesture that was generous by Roman standards. Cleopatra Selene would eventually be married to a client king of Mauritania, and through her, Cleopatra's blood would continue. Egypt became a province of Rome, but a special province, the personal possession of the emperor, rather than a regular province governed through the Senate. It was too important, too wealthy, for Octavian, who soon took the name Augustus, to risk letting it fall into potentially hostile hands. Roman prefects would govern Egypt on the emperor's behalf. Latin and Greek would replace Egyptian as the languages of administration. The old gods would continue to be worshipped, the old temples maintained, but the age of pharaohs was over. 3,000 years of history had come to an end. From the unification under Narmer, around 3,100 years before the Common Era, to Cleopatra's death in 30 years before the Common Era, Egypt had endured longer than any other ancient civilization. It had survived invasions, occupations, periods of fragmentation and weakness, always managing to recover its independence and its identity. But now, with Cleopatra's death, that long continuity was broken. There would never be another pharaoh. The temples would gradually fall silent. The hieroglyphs would cease to be written and would eventually be forgotten, their meaning lost for over 1,000 years until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. Yet, in another sense, Egypt did not die. Its influence had already spread throughout the Mediterranean world during the Ptolemaic period. Egyptian gods, especially Isis, were worshipped in Rome, in Greece, in temples as far away as Britain. Egyptian art and architecture had influenced Greek and Roman styles. Egyptian knowledge of medicine, mathematics, and astronomy had been absorbed into Hellenistic learning. The Great Library of Alexandria, though damaged over the years, continued to function as a center of scholarship well into the Roman period. Egypt, under Roman rule, remained wealthy and important, the breadbasket that fed Rome and the Eastern Roman Empire. The monuments still stood. The pyramids that had been ancient when Cleopatra was born remained ancient, had been ancient even when the first pharaohs unified the two lands. The temples continued to function, priests continued to perform rituals, people continued to worship the old gods. But the special character of Egypt, that unique civilization that had seen itself as separate from and superior to all other peoples, that sense of being the center of the world, the place where order and civilization held back chaos, that was fading. Cleopatra had been the last to embody it, the last to rule as pharaoh with full authority, the last to stand in the temples and perform the rituals that maintained Ma'at, the last to wear the double crown and claim sovereignty over the two lands. With her death, a door closed on the ancient world. What came after would be different, a new world dominated by Rome, where Egypt was merely a province, wealthy and important certainly, but no longer independent, no longer unique, no longer the eternal kingdom beside the eternal river. And yet, even in death, Cleopatra and the civilization she represented cast a long shadow. Her story would be told and retold by Plutarch and Dio Cassius in ancient times, by Shakespeare and Shaw in modern times. The image of Egypt, of pyramids rising from desert sands, of hieroglyphs carved in stone, of mummies wrapped in linen, of pharaohs who claimed to be gods, of a civilization that thought in terms of eternity, all of this would continue to fascinate, to inspire, to haunt the imagination of peoples who came after. Ancient Egypt might have fallen, but the memory of what it had been, the dream of what it had represented, would never truly die. It lives still today, whenever we gaze upon the pyramids, whenever we stand before a temple wall and marvel at the skill of ancient craftsmen, whenever we look into the painted face of a sarcophagus and wonder about the person who once lay within it, whenever we try to imagine what it must have been like to live beside the Nile 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, when the civilization was young and confident and believed it would last forever. In our remembering, in our wondering, something of ancient Egypt endures still. Chapter Wit. Legacy. Influence. When the last pharaoh died and Egypt became a province of Rome, the ancient civilization did not simply vanish into the dust of history. What had been built over 3 millennia, the knowledge accumulated, the beliefs refined, the artistic traditions perfected, the monuments raised, all of this continued to exist, continued to exert influence, continued to shape the world, even as the political independence that had created it was lost. The legacy of ancient Egypt would prove as enduring as the pyramids themselves, reaching across centuries and continents, touching civilizations that the ancient Egyptians never knew existed. The most immediate and visible legacy was architectural. The Romans who conquered Egypt were profoundly impressed by what they found. The temples at Karnak and Luxor, The pyramids at Giza, the rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel, the Sphinx weathered by millennia yet still powerful, all spoke of a civilization that had achieved greatness on a scale Rome itself was only beginning to match. Roman emperors built temples in Egyptian style, not just in Egypt, but in Rome itself. The Pantheon in Rome, with its massive columns and its sense of sacred space, shows Egyptian influence. Obelisks, those tapering stone shafts carved from single pieces of granite that the Egyptians had raised in front of their temples, were transported to Rome and erected in public squares. 13 ancient Egyptian obelisks still stand in Rome today, more than remain standing in Egypt itself. This architectural influence would persist through centuries. When Europeans in the 18th and 19th centuries sought to express power and permanence in their buildings, they often turned to Egyptian forms. Obelisks appeared in city squares across Europe and America. The Washington Monument in the capital of the United States is a massive obelisk, the tallest structure of its type in the world. Masonic lodges and fraternal organizations decorated their temples with Egyptian motifs. Egyptian revival became a recognized architectural style used for everything from cemetery gates to movie theaters, anywhere that builders wanted to evoke a sense of mystery, antiquity, and timeless grandeur. But the influence of Egypt went far deeper than architectural fashion. In the realm of religion, Egyptian beliefs and practices spread throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The worship of Isis, which had begun to spread during the Ptolemaic period, exploded across the Roman Empire. Temples to Isis were built in every major city from Britain to Mesopotamia. The mysteries of Isis, secret religious rites that promised salvation and eternal life to initiates, attracted followers from all social classes, including Roman emperors and empresses. The appeal of Isis worship was partly that it offered something the traditional Roman religion did not: a personal relationship with the divine, the promise of life after death for all believers, regardless of social status, and a goddess who was compassionate and merciful, who cared about individual suffering and responded to prayers. These elements, so central to the worship of Isis, would later influence Christianity as it developed and spread through the same regions. Some scholars see in the Christian image of Mary and the infant Jesus echoes of the ancient Egyptian images of Isis nursing the child Horus. The iconography may have changed, but something of the ancient devotion persisted. The concept of divine judgment, of the soul being weighed and measured after death, of paradise for the righteous and annihilation or punishment for the wicked, these ideas that were so central to Egyptian religion influenced Jewish, Christian, and Islamic eschatology. The Book of the Dead's description of the judgment of the soul, with its moral demands and its vision of an afterlife where justice prevails, resonated with later religious traditions, even though the specific forms changed. In the intellectual sphere, Egypt's contributions were immense. The Great Library of Alexandria, though founded by the Greek Ptolemies, was built on Egyptian soil and benefited from Egyptian wealth and Egyptian traditions of learning. For centuries, it was the greatest repository of knowledge in the world, attracting scholars and students from throughout the Mediterranean. The works preserved and studied there, the research conducted, the debates held, all contributed to the foundation of Western science and philosophy. Egyptian medicine, with its combination of practical remedies and magical spells, its surgical knowledge and pharmaceutical expertise, influenced Greek medicine and through it the entire Western medical tradition. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, lived after Egypt had already developed sophisticated medical knowledge. While we cannot prove direct transmission, the similarities are striking. The empirical approach of Egyptian physicians, their careful observation of symptoms and recording of treatments, their understanding that disease had natural causes even if they also believed in supernatural influences, all of this contributed to the development of rational medicine. Egyptian mathematics, though not as theoretically advanced as Greek mathematics would become, was highly practical and effective. The methods Egyptian engineers used to calculate the dimensions of pyramids, to survey fields after the annual flood, to calculate the capacity of granaries, to divide inheritances fairly, all demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of geometry and arithmetic. When Greek mathematicians like Thales and Pythagoras traveled to Egypt to study with Egyptian priests, as ancient tradition claims they did, they were accessing this accumulated knowledge and building upon it. The Egyptian calendar, with its 365-day year divided into 12 months of 30 days plus 5 extra days, was adopted by the Romans with minor modifications and eventually became the basis for the calendar used throughout the Western world. The Egyptian practice of dividing day and night into 12 hours each gave us our 24-hour day, though our hours are of equal length, while theirs varied with the seasons. In astronomy, the Egyptians made observations and kept records for thousands of years. They identified the planets, tracked their movements, recognized patterns in the stars. The Egyptian understanding that the heavens were orderly and predictable, that celestial movements followed laws that could be understood and used for practical purposes like creating calendars and determining the right times for religious festivals, contributed to the development of astronomy as a science. The invention of writing itself, developed independently in Egypt around the same time as in Mesopotamia, was perhaps humanity's greatest intellectual achievement, and the Egyptian hieroglyphic system was one of the most beautiful writing systems ever created. Though the hieroglyphs themselves were eventually forgotten after the temples closed and the last priests who could read them died, the concept of writing, of preserving knowledge in permanent form, of communicating across time and space through symbols, this revolution in human capability that Egypt helped pioneer, shaped all subsequent civilization. The Egyptian emphasis on permanence, on building for eternity, on creating works that would outlast their creators, influenced all subsequent cultures that came into contact with Egypt. The idea that human achievement could and should aspire to immortality, that great works could defeat time, that stone and word could preserve memory and meaning across millennia, this very Egyptian concept became part of the Western cultural heritage. In art, Egyptian influence was pervasive. The Egyptian canon of proportions, the way they depicted the human body, with the head in profile, but the eye frontal, shoulders frontal, but legs in profile, influenced Greek archaic art. The monumental scale of Egyptian sculpture, the emphasis on idealized forms representing eternal qualities rather than individual peculiarities, the use of stone to convey power and permanence, all these aspects of Egyptian art influenced Greek, Roman, and later Western artistic traditions. The rediscovery of ancient Egypt in modern times began with Napoleon's expedition in 1798. Napoleon brought with him not just soldiers but scholars, scientists, and artists who documented everything they found. The Description de l'Égypte, published in multiple volumes between 1809 and 1828, introduced Europe to the wonders of ancient Egypt in unprecedented detail. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone during this expedition, a stone bearing the same text in hieroglyphs, Demotic Egyptian, and Greek, provided the key that would eventually allow Jean-François Champollion to decipher hieroglyphs in 1822, opening Egyptian civilization to scholarly understanding after centuries of mystery. This rediscovery sparked Egyptomania, a fascination with ancient Egypt that swept through European and American culture in the 19th century. Museums competed to acquire Egyptian antiquities. Wealthy tourists visited Egypt to see the monuments. Artists incorporated Egyptian themes into their work. Writers set novels in ancient Egypt. The opening of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter intensified this fascination, as newspapers worldwide reported on the fabulous treasures found in the boy king's burial chamber. The supposed curse of the pharaohs, though entirely fictional, captured public imagination and ensured that ancient Egypt remained in the popular consciousness. In the 20th and 21st centuries, ancient Egypt continues to fascinate. Films from the Mummy franchise to historical epics to animated children's movies have brought Egyptian settings and stories to audiences worldwide. Video games allow players to explore ancient Egypt, to build pyramids, to rule as pharaohs. Museums with Egyptian collections are among the most visited cultural institutions. The treasures of Tutankhamun tour the world to enormous crowds. Books about ancient Egypt, both scholarly and popular, find ready audiences. This enduring fascination stems partly from the visual power of Egyptian remains, the pyramids that still dominate the landscape, the temples that still inspire awe, the golden treasures that still dazzle, the mummies that still provoke wonder mixed with unease. But it also stems from something deeper, from a recognition that this was a civilization that achieved something remarkable, that lasted longer than any other, that thought in terms of eternity, and created works that actually approached that impossible goal. Modern Egypt, the nation that exists today in the 21st century, is of course vastly different from ancient Egypt. The people speak Arabic, practice Islam, live in a modern state with modern concerns. The Nile still flows through the country, still vital to Egyptian life, though now controlled by dams and used for hydroelectric power as well as irrigation. The ancient monuments are tourist attractions, sources of national pride and revenue, but the religion that built them is long dead, the language that named them long silent. Yet connections persist. The Coptic language, the last descendant of the ancient Egyptian language, is still used in the liturgy of the Coptic Christian Church, though it is no longer spoken in daily life. The Coptic script, derived from Greek letters with a few additional signs from Demotic Egyptian, preserves something of the sound of the ancient language. Many Egyptians, both Muslim and Christian, take pride in the ancient civilization, seeing it as part of their heritage even across the gulf of millennia and the transformations of conquest and religious change. The lessons that ancient Egypt teaches remain relevant. The importance of adapting to environment, of working with nature rather than against it, lessons the Egyptians learned from the Nile's annual flood, speak to contemporary concerns about sustainability and climate change. The Egyptian emphasis on justice, on ma'at, on the moral responsibilities of rulers, and the divine judgment that awaits those who abuse power, offers a counterpoint to cynical political realism. The Egyptian confidence in the power of human creativity and determination, their willingness to undertake projects spanning decades or generations, their refusal to accept the limits of what seemed possible, reminds us that great achievements require great ambition. The Egyptian acceptance of death as a transition rather than an ending, their belief that what matters in a person endures beyond the body's decay, their determination to preserve memory and honor the dead, these attitudes offer a less fearful, more accepting approach to mortality than often prevails in modern Western culture. The Egyptian understanding that individuals exist within communities and traditions that extend across generations, that we inherit from the past and have obligations to the future, provides perspective in an age often focused on the immediate and the individual. Ancient Egypt also reminds us of civilization's fragility. This culture that seemed eternal, that built monuments designed to last forever, that believed in its own permanence, nevertheless fell. Foreign powers conquered it. Native dynasties ended. The language was forgotten. The gods ceased to be worshipped. The temples fell silent. If Egypt could fall, any civilization can fall. Nothing human is truly permanent, no matter how powerful it seems, no matter how carefully it plans for eternity. Yet the paradox is that while pharaonic Egypt fell, while its political independence ended and its distinctive culture was absorbed into larger patterns, the memory of what it had been endured, the monuments still stand. The artifacts fill museums. The texts have been deciphered and translated. The story has been reconstructed. We know ancient Egypt better than they could have imagined, better perhaps than most ancient Egyptians knew their own deep past. In being remembered, in being studied, in continuing to inspire and fascinate, ancient Egypt achieved a form of the immortality it sought. And so we come to the end of our journey through 3,000 years of history, from the unification of the two lands to the death of the last pharaoh. We have seen the pyramids rise, watched empires expand and contract, followed the Nile's eternal flow through changing times. We have met pharaohs great and small, conquerors and builders, reformers and heretics. We have explored beliefs about gods and the afterlife, examined achievements in art and architecture and science, witnessed the slow transformation and eventual fall of a civilization that thought itself eternal. As you drift toward sleep, let these images accompany you. The sun setting over the Nile, turning the water to liquid gold, while palm trees sway gently in the evening breeze. The pyramids rising dark against the stars, those same stars the ancient Egyptians knew by different names, but saw in the same patterns. The sound of water lapping against papyrus reeds, the call of an ibis in the marshes, the cool stone of a temple floor beneath your feet, the scent of incense in the air, the sense of enormous time compressed into this present moment. Ancient Egypt is gone, vanished into history, yet somehow still present, still speaking to us across the centuries, still teaching us, still inspiring wonder. The monuments endure. The river flows on. The stars wheel overhead. And the story, the long story of this remarkable civilization, continues to be told, continues to find new audiences, continues to remind us of what humans can achieve when they dare to dream of eternity. Rest now. Let the history of the Nile carry you gently into dreams, and may the peace that the ancient Egyptians sought in their eternal tombs find you in your rest tonight, here, now, at the end of this long journey through time. And so, as the night deepens and your breathing slows, as consciousness begins to fade into the realm of dreams, we arrive at the end of our journey. 3,000 years of history have unfolded before you like the waters of the Nile, spreading across the floodplain, touching everything, nourishing everything, leaving behind something precious when they recede. We have walked with the first farmers who settled along the river's banks, learning to read the rhythms of flood and harvest, laying the foundations for everything that would come after. We have stood before the pyramids when they were new, their limestone casing gleaming white in the desert sun, monuments to ambition and faith that would outlast empires. We have witnessed pharaohs rise and fall, some remembered for their wisdom and achievements, others forgotten, except as names carved in stone. We have followed armies into battle and priests into temples. We have seen Egypt at its greatest heights and watched it slowly decline, generation by generation, until finally foreign rulers wore the double crown, and even that ancient symbol lost its meaning. But what endures from all of this? What remains when the kings are dust and the empires fallen? The monuments remain, weathered but still standing, still capable of inspiring awe. The art remains, in museums now rather than in tombs, but still beautiful, still speaking of the people who created it. The knowledge remains, absorbed into the great stream of human learning, contributing to everything that came after. The stories remain, told and retold, changing with each telling but preserving something essential about who these people were and what they valued. And perhaps most importantly, the example remains. Ancient Egypt shows us that human civilization can endure for millennia if it finds the right balance between tradition and innovation, between accepting nature's gifts and working to improve upon them, between individual ambition and collective effort. It shows us that beauty and permanence are worthy goals, that creating something that will outlast our brief lives gives meaning to those lives. It shows us that death need not be feared if we live well and leave something behind, whether that be monuments in stone or simply the memory of who we were and how we treated others. The ancient Egyptians believed that to speak a person's name was to keep them alive, that as long as someone remembered you, you continued to exist in some form. By that measure, the civilization of ancient Egypt remains vibrantly alive. We speak their names: Khufu, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Ramesses, Cleopatra. We remember their deeds. We marvel at their achievements. We study their beliefs. We preserve their monuments. In our remembering, they live still. Tonight, as you sleep, you may dream of pyramids rising from golden sand, of temples echoing with ancient prayers, of the Nile flowing eternally toward the sea. You may walk through painted tombs where the walls come alive with scenes of daily life from 4,000 years ago. You may stand before the Sphinx and feel it gaze back at you with eyes that have watched the passage of millennia. These dreams, if they come, will carry you to a place that once was real, that once teemed with life, where people loved and labored, hoped and feared, lived and died, not so different from us despite the vast gulf of time that separates their world from ours. The Nile still flows through Egypt, still brings life to the desert as it has for millions of years. The sun still rises over the eastern cliffs and sets behind the western mountains, marking the passage of days as it did when the first pharaohs ruled. The stars still wheel overhead in their eternal patterns, the same stars that ancient priests studied and sailors navigated by, and farmers used to know when to plant their crops. The world changes, civilizations rise and fall, languages are spoken and forgotten, but some things endure, some rhythms continue, some patterns repeat across the ages. In this continuity, in this connection between past and present, between the ancient Egyptians who lived beside the Nile thousands of years ago, and you, here, now, listening to their story as you drift towards sleep, there is something profound and comforting. We are not alone, isolated in our moment of time. We are part of something larger, a chain of human experience stretching back to the dawn of civilization and forward to a future we cannot see. What they learned, we inherit. What they built, we preserve. What they dreamed, we remember. So rest now, knowing that you have touched, however briefly, a civilization that spanned 3,000 years, that created wonders still standing today, that thought deeply about the great questions of existence and left behind their answers carved in stone and painted on papyrus. Rest knowing that the story of ancient Egypt, like the Nile itself, flows on, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom and beauty of generations, enriching all it touches. The journey is complete. The story has been told. The ancient voices have spoken across the centuries, and you have listened. Now let sleep come gently. Let dreams carry you where they will, and may the peace of the ages settle upon you, like evening shadows falling across the pyramids, as another day ends in Egypt, as another night begins, as the eternal cycle continues, will always continue, as long as the river flows and the stars shine, and someone, somewhere, remembers what once was, and honors it in the remembering. Sleep well, traveler through time. Sleep deeply, and may your dreams be filled with the wonders of ancient Egypt, that remarkable civilization that rose beside the Nile, flourished for 3 millennia, and left behind a legacy that will endure as long as humans care about beauty, wisdom, and the eternal human desire to create something that will last forever. Good night.